Hello, everyone, and welcome to a follow-up stream to the one I did a couple of weeks ago, Drang nach Osten on the German-Ottoman relations. Tonight it's Osmandämmerung, the German-Ottoman alliance, and as last time, I'm very lucky to be joined by Apostolic Majesty. How are you, AM?
I'm okay and very happy to be on discussing this topic. Thank you for inviting me.
No, and just to go over the choice of title, this is something that I agonized over a little bit because I had a few different ideas. And so as we're talking about the German-Ottoman alliance, something we looked into last time was to what extent was Germany's interest in the Ottomans related to this idea of using the position of the Caliphate to launch a global jihad to destabilize the Entente powers. And that's something we will be exploring as part of this stream. And a term you see crop up a lot in sort of literature around this is this concept of a Kaiser jihad strategy, and your scholars leaning into this idea that Wilhelm's sort of Orientalism or fascination with Islam was somewhat responsible for this. And we did discuss it last time, and though I can see it, I personally think that that's ascribing too much responsibility to Wilhelm personally, and ultimately decided to not go with the Kaiser Jihad as a title because, again, if anything, it's more of a Freiherr Jihad because, again, I think if there's anybody who is culpable for it as a strategy, it's Baron Max von Oppenheim, someone we discussed last time, or will be bringing up again because he was the one who was really influencing the Kaiser and is the one who very much was acting as the sort of chief organizer of this jihad, if you can see it as a strategy. Another title I was actually going to go with and actually teased when I put a little screenshot in your Discord about a week ago was the Iron Crescent. And my idea for that was coming from the fact that during the war, the Ottomans issued like a new military medal, which was known in English as the Gallipoli Star, but the Germans called it the Eiserner Halbmond, or the Iron Crescent, and a lot of them were given out to the Germans. So I thought that was a nice symbol. But I then had another thought, and it's one I actually thought of a long time ago because this is actually a stream I had years and years ago, and I've only just finally got around to doing it. And I'm somewhat inspired by you, AM, for this because you did a mini-series on the Habsburgs, and you looked at the destruction of the Habsburg Empire in World War One, and you sort of conceived it as a Habsburg Dammerung, sort of the judgment and damnation of the House of Habsburg. And I've kind of sort of done the same here. Osmandämmerung, the judgment and damnation of the House of Osman, because ultimately the Ottomans' involvement with the Germans in World War One very much led to the destruction of their empire. And so, would you say that's a good title or a fair assessment, or?
Well, I have to be culpable for my sins here and say I never finished that series. It's part of a litany of unfinished projects on my channel, so I do apologize for that. I would actually say that referring to this period as a judgment on the Ottoman Empire is far better than my title of Habsburger Dammerung, because it really is a moral abyss if you're going to take it from that point of view. And it's very interesting that you push back on this idea of the Kaiser Jihad, because it plays into, again, a lot of established anti-German tropes, that the Kaiser really was the director of his foreign policy, and there was some sort of overall sort of German grand strategy referring to this, which I am of the complete opinion that there was not. It was done so at the behest of certain operatives, and you've already mentioned Max von Oppenheim, who are far more attracted to this idea. Yes, you can say that the Kaiser was influential within the first year or so of the war, but especially by late 1960 and 1970, the whole nature of the war had changed fundamentally. And indeed, what is fascinating here is that the Ottoman Empire, as you mentioned on the previous stream we did, had undergone a radical sort of ideological revision as a result of, well, the two Young Turk coups. This is going to be the second Young Turk coup under the three Pashas, where it seems to be the overriding concern, especially of Enver Pasha, is less to do with Islam and far more to do with ethnogenesis of a new Turkic identity. You can almost say a proto-republican identity for the empire, and that the Osman Caliph is really attached to all of these things. So everything to do with World War I is in some way misleading. And I think going for the Osman, the judgment of the House of Osman, therefore, is far more all-encompassing and far more accurate, as you have correctly deduced, over a Kaiser jihad.
No, certainly. And just to expand a bit on what you've just said, you're mentioning about the Young Turks sort of coming in and seeing the conflict as a more of an opportunity to expand, the Turkish state or Turkish nationalism. So in contrast to who exactly was behind these various strategies? Obviously, you mentioned Max von Oppenheim as the sort of champion of this sort of jihad strategy. And what's interesting is that Enver Pasha himself, the Ottoman Minister of War, was also very much taken with this idea of the jihad. However, he was much more cynical, and it's interesting. I think von Oppenheim was probably more of a true believer, ironically, in the jihad as a strategy and a prospect, whereas Enver Pasha was more cynical. Oh, this could be useful to destabilize the Russians and allow us to expand into the Turkic territories in the Caucasus and Central Asia.
Yes, you are completely correct. I think Enver Pasha was prepared to use the Muslim idea of the jihad to direct it against the Russians, which he believed was the principal enemy, primarily because he was trying to amalgamate the empire with the Azeri population in Azerbaijan. And if you can say there was one sort of grand target of his, the object of his jihad was Bukhara, the center of Muslim power in Central Asia, whereas from what we know about Max von Oppenheim and what we discussed about him last time, his main sphere of influence, I believe, was in Egypt. So that would have meant a general jihad across northern Africa, which a large swath of it had been Ottoman. Libya had been very recently in Ottoman possession before it was nabbed by the Italians, and of course directed against the British administration in India also. If there was going to be some sort of, you can almost say, damned idealism or complete foolhardiness, it was the belief that the Raj would topple and swear allegiance to the Caliph in Constantinople.
No, certainly, and one aspect we'll get into later is this Niedermeyer expedition, where the Germans send this mission under Oscar von Niedermeyer all the way through Persia into Afghanistan in hopes of trying to persuade the emir to join the jihad and invade India, but that ended up being a bit of a complete waste of time and resources, but I'll get into that in a bit. But in terms of sort of an alternate strategy, on here on the right, I've got Otto von Lehmann-Sanders, who was the leader of the German military mission to the Ottoman Empire and also the commander of the Ottoman First Army. And he had absolutely no time for the jihad strategy. He thought it was a complete fantasy and indulgence. And how he saw the Ottoman Empire's role in the war, he saw the Ottomans as useful allies. They could help bog down the Russians and the British and provide a distraction, whereas the real decisive theatre of the war was going to be in the West. And so he believed the Ottomans and Germans should just focus on maintaining the territorial integrity of the empire, using its natural frontiers and consolidating, because ultimately you've got to remember at this time is that the Berlin-Baghdad Express has not been fully finished yet. So there's still a degree of supply problems. And so once they've consolidated for a bit, then maybe they could push out and consolidate the neighboring territories. And also this is an idea that's very much buttressed by the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. He sees the East filling this exact purpose. Is there anything you want to add to that at all, or?
No, I just want to say that's a very level-headed policy, which I believe is correct in informing the overall German opinion from the High Command in terms of what role the Ottoman Empire could feasibly serve, especially when it came to 1915 and the Italian entry into the war and the overall effort in the West being bogged down on the Marne. The preconception of the German war strategy before then had been that France would be the secondary enemy and Russia would be the primary enemy. But after the defeat on the Marne and the Western Front and the victory over the Russians at Tannenberg on the Eastern Front, it became very clear that no, the entire sort of conception of German military planning was actually predisposed towards the wrong enemy, especially after the Russians retreated to Riga and deep into Belarusia and what we now know as Ukraine, because that would have actually given the Germans everything they wanted, which was a strategic depth for the Reich, for them to be able to prosecute the war on the Western Front. And very similar to that, if you take the alliance with Bulgaria that was also formed in that year of 1915, the occupation of Romania, the fact that Greece didn't enter the war, the fact that Serbia was ultimately occupied by the Bulgarians and the Austrians, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire also had a strong frontier against the Italians in the Alps. The purpose for the Ottomans was basically the same for the overall war effort that the Austro-Hungarians would later fulfill, which is providing strategic depth for the Reich, pushing the boundaries against the Russian Empire in particular. So yes, I think that is a fair reading of what the more pragmatic, grounded German aims were. And I mean, you and I mentioned this before we went on stream, but I think if you look at the views of Max von Oppenheim, it very much concerns a bizarre idealism that the West has regarding the whole nature of Islam. And I would say, to be more precise, the nature of Islamic authority and the complex nature of the role of the Caliph, and the fact that there are internal divisions, not just within the Shia Sunni Muslim split, but also within Sunni Islam as well. And this is going beyond the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence. And of course, we have to take in aspects such as nationalism as well and figure those into our views. And this isn't just the same for Islam. This is also the same for something we also mentioned on the previous stream, which is Zionism and the views of certain Jewish Zionists, and being able to take, say, for example, the ideological uber sympathy among the Protestant dispensationalists, say, for example, in order to support their own views of a Jewish state, in the same way that Enver Pasha, as you mentioned, seemed to have a far more pragmatic view, where he's going to exploit the Caliph ideology when necessary. When it comes to the Westerners and the Europeans, they tend to border on pure fantasy, if not complete and utter folly.
No, certainly. And just before we move on, I also want to quickly address a little bit of historiography regarding this idea of how much the jihad strategy guided the German policy in the Middle East. And so the views I sort of canvassed from reading Meeken again for this stream is that, on the one hand, you have a historian like Fritz Fischer, who wrote a book called Germany's Aims in the First World War. Fischer argues that the Kaiser's jihad strategy was central to Germany's war aims. In contrast to that, you have another historian called Ulrich Trumpener in his book German-Ottoman Empire. He makes a counter-argument that though the idea of jihad was discussed, it was never a coherent plan or strategy. My view is somewhere between these two. I believe it was a sincere strategy that members important within the Germany and the Ottoman Empire, such as Oppenheim and Pasha, wanted to indulge in and invest into. However, I just think it was really badly planned and organized, and that's why it ultimately failed.
It's very interesting you bring up Fritz Fischer. Fritz Fischer is one of these historians that anyone encountering like modern German historiography knows about, because during the 1960s, he came out and he sort of reinvigorated the cause of German exceptionalism during World War One, and German war guilt in particular, and Germany being responsible for the First World War. And if you look at the caliphate idea as some sort of preconceived notion, then it definitely fits rather nicely into that view, that the Germans had all of these schemes for world conquest, and they all sort of knitted nicely towards each other. The destruction of Russia on the one hand, the elimination and occupation of the French Third Republic, and expanding into Middle Africa, the September program of Bettman Holweg, all of these things would seem to be conducive to this plan, where, of course, my view is that all of these things were rather post hoc. From the point of view of German military planners, the only certainty that existed in foreign relations on the eve of the First World War was the Austrian alliance. Everything else was basically up in the air. As you've already mentioned on the previous stream, the Germans, after the Young Turk coup against Abdulhamid II, were prevaricating. They were prevaricating between the various Entente powers. Italy was still technically allied with Germany until 1 week before the Italians declared war on Germany and Austria. So all of these things were up in the air. And it's very interesting, again, you and I were discussing before we came on, how I was talking about, I mentioned the idea that there was German provocation in Morocco during the Agadir crisis, propping up the Sultan of Morocco, later the King of Morocco, against the entreaties of the French to establish a protectorate there. By extension, if the Moroccan Sultan was propped up, then it could serve as a banner case against the French colonization of much of West Africa, which was predominantly Muslim. So even these ideas, you have to sort of look at the Ottoman Empire and say that they would actually only feature as an aspect of the caliphate or the sort of grand Kaiser jihad idea. Rather, it would be prevarication and provocation against the colonial authorities for the sake of Muslims everywhere, whether the Ottomans aligned to them or not. Because if you pursued, again, this anti-colonial strategy, now that the Germans had effectively been thwarted in their plans for Weltpolitik to establish a colonial empire to rival their great adversaries in France and Britain, the Ottoman Empire can't actually be considered to be a pillar of that idea if the Ottoman state is going to switch sides, and indeed if the Ottoman Caliphate is going to be completely and utterly politically subordinated or even possibly removed. That is a feature that would have, again, prefigured a lot of German notions that the whole caliphate structure within the Ottoman Empire after the deposition of Abdulhamid II was incredibly precarious. So, as you can probably tell by my lengthy oration there, I'm very much of the opinion that all of these things were policies in motion, and the events on the ground were changing very, very quickly. And that is really encapsulated in the whole quote unquote July crisis, which led to the declaration of the First World War. Is less of a July crisis, it's more of a week-long crisis predating the declarations of war. And indeed, the German planning was so fluid, they didn't even properly consider the implications of a British land army being sent to support the French as well. So all of these things were up in the air. And as you and I discussed, the German-Ottoman alliance wasn't even a sure thing until weeks into the actual declaration of war against Russia.
No, certainly, because we've mostly looked at what the German interests were, or other than Enver Pasha's own interest in sort of pan-Turkic nationalism. But we discussed last time, the Ottoman, the Grand Vizier made a hefty list of demands of the Germans for involvement in the war, and that we want restitution of all these territories, we want heavy economic investment, we want advisors. So they did put pretty heavy fires to their involvement, and quite understandably, considering it led to the destruction of their empire. And another point I just want to make before we go on is more about this, I think, fundamental misunderstanding the Germans had of the nature of Islam, because one important distinction to make is ultimately in the Muslim world, there's the concept of the Ummah, and this is the global sort of Muslim community. All Muslims belong to the Ummah and are nominally the subjects of the Caliph. However, that's only sort of de jure, it's not de facto. The Ottoman Caliph's de facto subjects are all the subjects in the empire itself, not the Ummah. And this, I think, is ultimately the tragedy of the Caliphate, where if you go all the way back to the original Islamic conquest, which set up the Ummah, the Rashidun, Umayyad, and later Abbasid caliphs, at the beginning, the Ummah was quite small because the only Muslims were the Arabs themselves who conquered all these lands, whereas their empire was quite wide because they've conquered the Persian Empire, they've conquered significant portions of the Byzantine Empire, and eventually conquered Visigothic Spain. But as time goes on, as the Ummah expands and they convert more people to Islam, their empire starts to fragment and break apart to the point where you have a very large Ummah but a very small actual temporal authority of the caliphs themselves. And I think this ultimately, the German failure to understand this is why they thought when they had won the caliph to their cause, they thought, oh great, we've got this great authority with all these subjects, this will be a piece of cake, and when actually no, it wasn't.
Well, it was completely deluded, and you've outlined the reasons there. I mean, to put this even more in sort of contention, the whole idea of an Ummah owing their allegiance towards the Ottoman Sultan, even the Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria claimed some sort of universalship in terms of authority over all Muslims, Sunni Muslims. The Shia Muslims in Iran similarly had a historic animosity towards the Ottomans. But I think it's important, if we're going to figure the whole idea of the caliphate so strongly in this discussion, to talk about what the Ottoman Caliphate really is, because very early on in the Muslim history, which you've already alluded to, there was something known as the Abbasid Revolution, which deposed the original. First of all, we have the rightly guided caliphs, the four that follow on from the Prophet, and that ends with the deposition of Ali, which leads to the major religious schism within Islam, Shia versus Sunni. And then among the Sunni majority, we have the Umayyad caliphs. When the Abbasids effected their coup decades later, they didn't keep the integrity of Islam as a united political unit. The Umayyads were able to hold on to parts of Northwest Africa and the Muslim conquest of Spain, and the Abbasids never held authority over that territory. And indeed, the Abbasid control was, I would say, rather ephemeral. After Harun al-Rashid, which was the beginning of the 9th century, Abbasid control basically was concentrated around a few cities in Mesopotamia and ultimately centered on Baghdad. And in the 13th century, the Mongols under Hulagu destroyed the city of Baghdad. And so really from then, the titular caliph was just that, someone holding nominal authority by some sort of hereditary mandate because they claimed lineage from the Prophet. And they were basically kept as prisoners of the Mamluk Sultan in the city of Cairo. So when Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim in the year 1516 and 1517 destroyed the Mamluk Sultanate, he captured the caliph, defrocked the caliph, and basically requisitioned the titles and authorities and the symbols associated with the caliph. He also occupied control over Mecca and Medina. Thereby, he became the custodians of the two great holy cities of Islam, including also Jerusalem at this point, the third. And so that's basically the right of conquest. There was a very dubious genealogy that was established in hindsight, as well as, it should be mentioned, the whole pretext of allowing Constantinople to be the capital of a Muslim polity, to confirm these symbols and powers of office legitimately upon the Ottomans. And because of that, the Ottomans are just that. They are a caliph by right of conquest. And what typified the Ottomans vis-a-vis these previous caliphates that I've alluded to, Bede, is that the Ottomans were able to hold on to a stable authority for far longer. They were able to hold on to that position really up until the 19th century in terms of their nominal headship over most of Islam, most of the holy sites. But by the time we get to the 19th century, the whole notion of the Ottoman Caliph and the symbol of authority of Islam within the Ottoman Empire was becoming a nonsense. We're having the beginning of nationality conflicts within the Ottoman Empire, liberalism and parliamentarianism into the Ottoman Empire, democracy in terms of the Ottoman Empire. And on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire, we're beginning to see Muslim resistance. So the Ottomans never fully controlled Arabia, for example. There was a Salafist Saudi insurgency, which dominated the interior of Arabia. And by the time we get to the beginning of the 20th century, the family which nominally controlled the great cities of Mecca and Medina on behalf of the Ottoman Caliph, the Hashemite dynasty, which again claim descent from the Prophet, so they have their own claim on the caliphate itself, they entered into open rebellion, and it was augmented and supported by Lawrence of Arabia. So the Sharifs became great holy figures of Islam within their own right. So add to that the final nail in the coffin for the caliphate idea, which is the whole notion that these liberal nationalistic forces have actually completely overtaken the Sultanate itself, and the Caliph has returned to the position of basically being a prisoner within the cage of the harem. It's moved now from the Topkapi to the Dolmabahce palaces, but nevertheless, that political situation continues. I think we've alluded to last time, the only real exception to this for a century was Abd al-Hamid II. So if you take all of these factors into consideration, it really does seem to be the misapplied dreams of a Islamophile European sort of literati. And as a result of it, the Islamophilia has basically superseded any practical policy considerations that we can see from the German military planners who are looking at this more rationally. There was a very long sort of point to just substantiate this idea, which you've alluded to, which is how much of a sort of stupid idea the whole jihad based on the caliphate really was.
Certainly, and thank you for all that elaboration. Just got the question in the chat here from Angelic's Domain. I'd wondered why the Caliph title was never revived after the Ottomans fell, but I've never looked into it. That makes sense, though. Well, I actually have a stream behind the paywall with my good friend Hunger. We looked at an essay by the Middle East scholar Eli Kaduri, where we were looking at the schemes of the Egyptian kings, Farouk and his father Fawad, in trying to establish a caliphate for Egypt after Ataturk had abolished it in 1924. That didn't end up going anywhere for various reasons. But so if you're interested in if you join the channel and become a member, the bottom tier, which is the novice tier, you should be able to get access to that series and watch that stream if you so wish.
And just to reiterate that the whole Egyptian program actually suffers from many of the points that we've already raised here, which is that the political forces on the ground favored a left-leaning, liberal, nationalist, pan-Arabist program more so than a strictly Muslim one. I would actually say the fact that Islam has become so preeminent within the Middle East as a political factor since the 1970s is really a consequence of the increase in Saudi oil and the Persian Gulf states. It really has nothing to do with what you can say to be the consistent ideological trajectory of these states. It seems to be an infusion of cash from sources which, under sort of any historical precedent, would be completely ephemeral to any discussion of Arabian politics.
Oh, no, certainly. Okay. And so from this point, I actually wanted to do a bit of reading from Meakin. So, okay. So to dismiss the importance of pan-Islam and Germany's wartime plans, however, is to fall victim to hindsight. In 1940, not when they were writing post-war memoirs, Germany's leaders saw in Islam the secret weapon which would decide the world war. Certainly, they acted as if they believed this, even if in some cases only to honour the Kaiser's own enthusiasm for the idea. For example, Baron Hans von Wangenheim, Germany's influential ambassador to the Porte, figures in Trumpenner's account as a skeptic of the jihad policy, who had to be dragged kicking and screaming into supporting it, but there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. Wangenheim, an ambitious diplomat who dreamed of becoming chancellor, was nothing if not loyal to his emperor. As he wrote to Bethmann Hollweg from Constantinople in mid-August of 1914, the revolutionizing of the Islamic world desired by His Majesty is prepared and has been for some time. These measures have been undertaken under strict secrecy. Enver Pasha, the Ottoman war minister, who consulted almost daily with the German ambassador, was fully on board, although Turkey had not yet entered the war. According to Wangenheim, Enver had already dispatched agents to spread the word of the coming jihad to Afghanistan, the Caucasus, Baghdad, Benghazi, and Cairo. Of Enver's good faith in the kindling of the pan-Islamic movement, Wangenheim promised the Chancellor, surely there can be no doubt. Surely there can be doubt. Contrary to Trumpenner's assertion, there was concrete evidence that Turco-German jihad action plans were ready to go when the guns of August started firing. According to Wangenheim, a commission for the preparation of Islamic Baluchistan, consisting of 8 tough Armenians, had been dispatched with German funds in mid-July, weeks before the war's outbreak. Similar German jihad preparation teams had already been sent to Persia and Russian Dagestan, while the Turks themselves had sent jihad agents everywhere from the Sudan to the subcontinent. On the 1st of August, the very day Germany declared war on Russia, a mission led by Dr. Otto Mansmann was sent to Tripoli with orders to foment uprisings in French North Africa, intending to use balloons to distribute jihadi pamphlets. Hard on the heels of the British declaration of war on the 4th of August, the Turkish War Ministry, after decreeing general mobilization at German insistence, ordered the Ottoman Fourth Army in Damascus to begin planning an assault on the Suez Canal. Fortuitously, one of Germany's leading pre-war Arabists, Professor Bernhard Moritz, the Kedivor Library director whom Kurt Prover had been intended to replace in 1911, arrived in Damascus on the 8th of August 1914, overland from the Sinai Desert, following a scouting trip in Arabia. Moritz gave the Turkish army commanders a thorough briefing on the latest English troop dispositions at Suez, the best routes across the Sinai, the locations of oases and wells, of which there are few, the likely attitudes of the Bedouins, and the availability of camels. Hasty improvisation this may have been, but it was inspired nonetheless. The Ottoman Empire may still have been officially neutral during the World War, but from Germany's perspective, as Richard Hannay said of his American collaborator in Greenmantle, it was the best kind of neutrality I've ever heard of. The Despite the Turks' continued hesitation to enter the war on Germany's side, it was in the heady days of August 1914, while the war of movement continued on both the Western and Eastern front, that the Holy War fever was at its strongest. In those days, everything seemed possible, from taking Paris in 6 weeks to the rapid-fire destruction of the British and Russian empires. Here, as Peter Hopkirk wrote in his great yarn on Secret Service east of Constantinople, a new and more sinister version of the old great game. If the classic version of the context had been a kind of 19th century Cold War with only indirect skirmishing between Britain and Russia and Central Asia, the Kaiser's jihad would be a hot war, with the espionage and propaganda struggle punctuated by real battles. The allure of the new great game was extremely seductive. For the most part, the world knows the story through the largely exaggerated exploits of Lawrence of Arabia and from John Buchan's wartime bestseller Greenmantle. Yet the British were slow to cotton on. It was not until 1916 that Lawrence set foot in Arabia and Buchan's novel enraptured British audiences. The Germans, by contrast, were playing the game in deadly earnest in the first days of August 1914. It was on Moltke's own instructions, given on the 5th of August, one day after Britain declared war on Germany, that the German Foreign Office began recruiting spies and agents for the jihad. Moltke wired the Ottoman War Ministry on the 10th, requesting that Enver begin organising Islamic uprisings to tie down Russian and English forces. On the 7th of August, State Secretary Gottlieb von Jagov instructed the German consulate in Stockholm to establish contact with the Persian Shah's gendarmerie, a Swedish bodyguard, some of whom were conveniently on leave in Sweden. The objective was to promote an Islamic insurgency targeting Russia from northern Persia and Azerbaijan. As Jagov's intervention in Sweden suggests, German consulates in neutral countries were prime recruiting grounds for the global jihad. Many supplicants.
Can I just mention how funny? Sorry, but for interrupting you, I just find that so funny. The idea that von Moltke, the German chief of staff, has been told, this is great, the great caliphate is going to explode, and we're going to have all these insurrections throughout all Africa and so harsh. And gets on the phone and basically says, we need more insurrections, we need more uprisings, as if it can simply be achieved that easily. I think it just shows the how completely ephemeral these ideas were from serious military considerations. The fact that von Moltke would suggest such a ridiculous idea that you can just invent insurrections out of effectively nowhere based on these idiotic musings from the misguided sort of German Islamophiles. I find that very interesting.
Is it we shall have jihad, inshallah, and that was a great accent by the way.
So sorry for interrupting you.
Oh, no, it's fine. No, that was a great interruption. Okay. And Jagov's intervention in Sweden suggests German consulates in neutral countries were prime recruiting grounds for the global jihad. Many supplicants, particularly in Switzerland, were exiled Egyptian pretenders, Arab sheikhs, and Indian princes, manoeuvring to secure German goodwill in case Britain's days were done. The lure of German jihad ensnared European sympathisers too, like Sven Hedin, the world-famous Swedish explorer who shared his intimate geographical knowledge of Afghanistan and India's northwestern mountain passes with the German consul in Stockholm, the idea being to plan an Islamic holy war in British India. Although there was a great deal of activity in Switzerland and Sweden, the epicenter for recruiting for the German jihad was the Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. No less than the army, the Foreign Office was beset by volunteers in August 1914, with every German who had ever worked or lived in the Orient eager to get in on the action. Many were the kind of ne'er-do-wells in civilian life who thrive on the racket of war, but Germany's jihad volunteers also included perfectly respectable businessmen, like the Mansman brothers sent to stir up jihad in Morocco. Other improbable German jihadists included Albert Ballin, owner of the Hamburg America shipping line, which had recently become active in the Persian Gulf, and Robert Vonkhaus, who owns a small shipping company actually based in Basra. Another prominent volunteer was Professor Otto Warburg of the University of Berlin, a sign of the Hamburg banking dynasty which handled German government finances, a world-renowned botanist and not incidentally a chairman of the International Zionist Executive in Berlin. Just going back to that old Jewish connection again. The brothers Mansman, Ballin, Warburg, and Vonkhaus all figure prominently in one of the most extraordinary policy papers ever drawn up by a civilized government. This overview of revolutionary activity we will undertake in the Islamic Israelite world, written on the 16th of August 1914, at a time when the fighting in Europe has scarcely begun, proposed that Germany combine the Kaiser's anti-British jihad with an Israelite-cum-Zionist rebellion in Russia. Once it became clear that the global Zionist movement had the backing of Germany's powerful army, Jews in the Pale of Settlement would, with German encouragement, sabotage grain depots and deliveries, thus starving the Russian army. Once the regime began to wobble, Russian Jews would then lead the way in toppling the Russian Tsar, the greatest enemy of world Jewry. Meanwhile, Turco-German jihadi propaganda could be distributed via Funkhaus and Hamburg America ships to Hajj pilgrims coming or going from the Hejaz, which would allow the waves of rebellion to spread from Egypt via Mecca to the entire Islamic world as far as India. Baron Max von Oppenheim had been born for this moment. Having recently settled down in Berlin after over 2 decades of travel and study in the Orient, the prophet of global jihad was in the perfect place at the perfect time. Summoned to the Wilhelmstrasse from his Kurfürstendamm flat on the 2nd of August 1914, the same day Germany's secret treaty with Turkey was signed, Oppenheim did not hesitate for a second to serve the Foreign Office, which had rudely disowned him only 4 years ago. Where before the Baron had been kept at arm's length because of his Jewish origins and questionable quasi-native lifestyle in Cairo, he was now given the rank of minister in residence and offered every perk imaginable. The parvenu had arrived. With the Foreign Office at last behind him, Oppenheim began sketching out an ambitious blueprint. Jihad headquarters would be Berlin itself, where Oppenheim planned to create a pan-Islamic propaganda clearinghouse to publish anti-Entente screeds in German, French, English, Russian, and Dutch, which would also be translated into Arabic, Turkish, Persian, Hindustani, Swahili for German and British East Africa, and eventually into languages of Russian Muslims. Germany must, Oppenheim wrote to Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg on the 18th of August 1914, on the Muslim brotherhoods of Libya, Sudan, and Yemen. She must fund Arab exile pretenders, including the deposed Egyptian Khedive Abbas Hilmi, who had conveniently been trapped in Constantinople during the July crisis. She must raise the standard of anti-colonial rebellion in French North Africa and Russian Central Asia. Above all, Germany must incite Habibullah Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan, to invade British India at the head of an Islamic army. The Emir, Oppenheim informed the Chancellor, would already dispose of 40 to 50,000 armed men. According to Wangenheim, Enver had already agreed to send a Turkish military mission to buttress the Emir's forces and to the command of 20 to 30 German officers. The signs of visible cooperation between His Majesty the King and Emperor of Germany and the Ottoman Sultan Caliph in Afghanistan, Oppenheim promised Bethmann Hollweg would incite Muslims from Cairo to Calcutta to rise and shake off the yoke of British imperial rule. Even if the rebellions failed to materialize or if the war were over too quickly, Oppenheim assured the Chancellor that the mere threat of an Indian Muslim uprising would force England to agree to peace terms favorable to us. And it's just interesting, isn't it, reading all of that? On the one hand, it sounds like something like a Bond villain would come up with, but no, this is actually something that was seriously written about by policymakers in Germany.
Well, there's a lot to talk about there. I think one important thing to mention is that it does seem a bit like just throwing darts on a dartboard and seeing which sticks. The whole idea of an anti-Russian Islamo-Jewish uprising, which, funnily enough, actually materializes in a form that the Germans never anticipated. But it's not, I would say, a serious policy consideration, because, as we know, the Kaiser had romantic attachments to the whole idea of the Dreikaiserbund, the League of the Three Emperors, and the defense of monarchy. And when we see basically the SEAL train and sending over the various Lenin, in addition to his Jewish Bundist communist comrades over to Leningrad, to ultimately will become Leningrad, what was then Petrograd, to begin the proletarian revolution. That was very much a thing done under extreme sort of duress and completely in abhorrence with the sort of ideological sort of implications there. There's another interesting thing you mentioned, which is the role of German commerce and businesses. And really, you could say from their point of view, this could be the real beginning of Weltpolitik. Because Barlin is one of these fascinating figures. You mentioned the German cruise line operator from the Hamburg America line. The Germans were really the ones to pioneer the transatlantic passenger cruise liner. Of course, you have figures like Brunel before that, can't be understated. But nevertheless, when we think of ships like the HMS, when we think of the Titanic, say, for example, and we think of the White Star Line Company and later Cunard, etc., it was really the Germans who began all of this and started the ball rolling. And when we think of the sort of great ocean liners of the day, you have to think of the SS Vaterland and the SS Imperator, which are Berlin ships. And what Germany was failing to achieve in terms of colonial possessions, as per Wilhelm's Weltpolitik, they were succeeding in the commercial line of business, which is all the remarkable. So the Germans being able to expand and take over the Suez Canal via their Ottoman proxies and linking it up to Basra, and again, potentially dominating the commercial line market with a potentially free India in the future, would be from the point of view of a sort of long-sighted businessman, you can really say that, you know, Berlin was the commercial arm of Germany's Weltpolitik. I find that very interesting. There is a question maybe you won't be able to answer, but nevertheless, it's something I'm going to put out there. The German planning for the jihad within India in particular focused on the Emir of Afghanistan. And what I've always found rather strange about that is that I would have thought if this were a serious policy, not just a fantasy, is that the Germans wouldn't have courted the Emir of Afghanistan. They would have instead focused on the Nawab of Hyderabad. Because for people who don't know, the British Raj wasn't a monolithic superstructure. It was an alliance structure based on central British governorships with tandem alliances with a lot of Indian notables. And by far the richest and most powerful of all of these Indian notables was actually a former Mughal viceroy in the south of India, based in the city of Hyderabad, which was the Nawab. So I've always found interesting that if this policy really had any, you know, teeth to it, being able to induce the Muslim Nawab to revolt against the British would have been a far sounder policy, because if he went, then by extension, all of the other Muslim, and not even necessarily Muslim, but all of the Rajas within India could revolt against the British, like we see a replay of, I think you and I have discussed this before, the Sepoy Rebellion in 1858. So it seems very strange to me that they fixated upon this figure who wasn't even a prince in the Raj, the Emir of Afghanistan. Is there any extant literature on that? Because I haven't come across any, but it's just an idea that I'm putting out there.
Well, from what I'm reading and what we might get into a bit later, is essentially I think the Germans saw obviously the fact that Afghanistan had these series of wars with Britain, the three Anglo-Afghan wars, and so they saw there was somewhat animosity, and the Afghans ideally wouldn't want Britain as their overlord. And so maybe
I understand that. I'm more thinking from the point of view of the Indians. Why would they, in particular, want to take the lead of the Emir of Afghanistan? Because, as you know, the Indians would have had memories of the Durrani Empire and their excursions into northern India and the sack of Delhi. And I don't think that is the sort of impression you want to leave in terms of the positive opinions that Indians would have had towards the Pashtun population in Afghanistan. Maybe I'm over-egging that, but I think it may have been a consideration.
No, that's actually an interesting idea, and I think quite valid. All I can think of is, you know, in a way, I think it was a stretch for the Germans to send a mission all the way to Afghanistan, because they haven't even consolidated Persia in their sphere of influence, and so that's that problem. So, you know, I think the Germans sending a mission all the way to Hyderabad through India, I don't think would have worked, because I just imagine it just would have been captured on the way.
Well, I don't mean just during the war. I mean cultivating this view before the war, because obviously the Mughal emperors had been defrocked and removed by the British during the Sepoy Rebellion. So, and yes, someone is mentioning the diamond mines at Golconda, which are very significant in terms of the commercial history of the empire, and why the Nawab of Hyderabad was so wealthy is because of that connection. It also forms part of a greater part of the history of India during the 17th century. So, like I said, if I were someone like Bettman Hollweg, or I were high up within the German Foreign Office or the German Chancellery, I would have been thinking about cultivating these relations, parallel sort of relations with the British beforehand. Like I've alluded to the idea that the British weren't just courting the Ottoman Sultan, they were also courting the King of Morocco. You know, you can even extend this to all minor German princelings, including the Nigerians, which again is something that I haven't researched into, but it's an interesting angle, because there are Muslim princelings throughout, you know, all of North Africa and India, etc. It's just, I mean, you could even, you know, extend this as far as Indochina, where there are still Muslim populations. I mean, you could even think of a Muslim population uprising in Malaya. I mean, why not? If you're thinking of deposing the British everywhere, you know, you can think of forming an alliance with the Muslim population in Western China. and invading Tibet and invading Nepal. I mean, we're talking about political fantasies here. I don't think any of these are any more ridiculous than talking about courting the Emir of Afghanistan to spawn some sort of spontaneous uprising among the Muslims. I think all of these things. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that this actually shows how unserious all of these policies are. Because if you're thinking of a real grand strategy made on predicated on unmaking the British Empire and on actually wanting to bring about a total war to fruition, then if anything, this completely negates the Fisher thesis, as far as I'm concerned, because the Germans did not have a clear plan. They were simply prepared to entertain ideas and lofty fantasies brought to them by hacks and ne'er-do-wells like Max von Oppenheim. I think really that this just confirms my view of German overall strategy outside of Europe, where it was very serious.
No, absolutely. And from that point, I just want to move on. So,
I mean, do you would you concur if you looked into all of the implications of the scope of potential Muslim alliances, that this really wasn't a well thought out plan?
sorry, no, I agree with you. As I said earlier, I think this problem with this jihad strategy was it was very poorly planned out. And I guess that's one angle. There was a poor choice of allies. They went with the Emir of Afghanistan over the Nawab of Hyderabad. And another thing, if you think about it, obviously Hyderabad is right in the middle of India, so that would have been a significant disruption to the
Yes, exactly.
British.
I mean, we do. Obviously, you wouldn't have, thought about, bringing a map of India for this conversation. But if you people listening to go up and look at a map of India, if Hyderabad were to fall, then basically all of southern India is basically lost to the British, and more importantly, Bombay is directly threatened. So, major implications, far better than invading across the Hindu Kush.
And one other point is just to illustrate the strength of Hyderabad. When you eventually get the Indian independence, Hyderabad was one of the only two princely states that actually tried to run an independent course. Ultimately, they failed and the Indians conquered them. But that just goes to show that they felt strong and wealthy enough to actually try and resist being integrated into India. So,
indeed.
And so, in terms of getting into the war proper, so in the early stage, the main sort of linchpin of this sort of the German-Ottoman strategy is they want to strike at Egypt and capture the Suez Canal for obviously obvious logistical reasons. And so, obviously, around this time, so Jamal Pasha, the Minister of the Navy, is sent off to Syria to command the Ottoman Fourth Army, and a couple of German officers are attached to him. So the main advisor he's given is this figure on the crest von Kressenstein, and of course Kurt Pruger, who we mentioned last time, is also added. And what's interesting is in the German-Ottoman sort of military operations, they sort of run into the Habsburg problem where there's so many different languages. So, for example, the Germans speak German and maybe some French, whereas all of the Ottoman officers speak Turkish and maybe some Arabic, but they don't speak German. And here comes this Kurt Pruger, this sort of polyglot who speaks German, Turkish, and Arabic, and he's able to help keep the operation somewhat fluid. And because ultimately there was a lot of ego contest between Kressenstein and Pasha, so who was in control, and it ended up being agreed that Jamal Pasha would be responsible for the overall strategy of the region, whereas Kressenstein would take responsibility for the training and supplies. And what sort of happens is once Jamal Pasha does arrive in Syria, is they start him issuing the Fetvas, which is the official declaration of jihad by the Ottoman Caliph. And what they start doing is they start sort of detaining all of the non-Ottoman European subjects, so including like French and British sort of civilians in the Levant, to start detaining them. And it's actually around this time that the British start to navally threaten Syria. You even have Captain Frank Larkin of the Royal Navy wants to bombard Beirut and Alexandretta in order to try and hinder the Ottoman supplies in the region. And in retaliation, Jamal Pasha says, well, if you do that, we're just going to execute all of the, for every one Muslim you kill, we're going to kill like 3 or 4 civilians. And so This obviously really hurts Germany's reputation because this is literally a war crime that breaks the Geneva Convention. But ultimately, the Kressenstein just says, well, we don't take any responsibility for the Ottomans' actions because they are their actions are not ours. Sorry, did you want to add something?
No, I just want to say that this is the origin of the Safno, the great starvation of the Lebanese population. Because the irony, of course, is that you allude to the fact that if the Germans spoke a second language, it was going to be French. Well, therefore, the only population which they could seriously communicate with would be the Catholics, because the Catholics, via their missionaries, were essentially French speakers up until the papacy in the early 20th century decided to, after this period, it should be mentioned, embark on a new policy, which was to Arabize the Catholic populations within the region. But Lebanon had been a great success story of the sort of late empire period, or the new imperialism period, as the center of the Beirut Vignette. And ironically, it was the Franco-British blockade that destroyed that prosperity. And because of the relatively sort of isolated geography of Lebanon, it's basically surrounded by mountains on all sides. It's really only accessible by the sea. That meant it was uniquely determined by its access to the sea, and so suffered uniquely as a result of the blockade. And so the European, from their point of view, when we're talking beyond the ideas of Ottoman reprisals, we're simply talking about the idea that the Europeans, through their indirect actions, were responsible for deaths on the scale of hundreds of thousands. We all think about the Armenian genocide, but the horrific thing about the Ottoman War is that it just masked a series of genocides of so many different populations, even though you can look at the Safno and say it wasn't necessarily a genocide because it wasn't intentional. It was simply something that the Ottomans acquiesced to because the population, due to the French connection, was already of dubious allegiance to begin with. So yes, just to illustrate your overall sort of conception of this as a judgment of the House of Osman.
Certainly, thank you. And I just also now want to address something which is a bit of a contradiction, really, in the whole jihad strategy, that you have a Germany who's nominally a Christian power utilizing Islamic jihad, and ultimately, because jihad is Islamic holy war. In the Quran it says you must kill the infidel. That's anybody who's not a Muslim, and so you've got this deliberate contradiction, and you have this absurd situation where Ottomans and start going around and trying to imprison, harass, or abuse non-Muslims. So not only non-Muslim Ottoman subjects such as the Lebanese Arabs, but you also see it against other Europeans, including supposed allies of the Ottomans, like including Germans and Austrians, and even Hungarians were harassed. And funny enough, even the American consul in Damascus was actually harassed as well. And the Germans have to run around trying to rein the Ottomans in, going, no, the jihad is only against the Entente, not against all infidels. And again, it just adds to the sort of absurdity of the idea, doesn't it?
Well, again, it's the whole notion that they're not really taking these things into serious consideration. They're just throwing ideas out there and see what would be a militarily effective strategy. But of course, because we're talking about the notion of total victory ahead of any other consideration, then from the point of view of the German military planners, the death of the infidel who just so happened to be Christian have to be considered to be an exceptional loss, which is absolutely horrific. But I think it, again, just further plays into the idea that these people are fundamentally naive and they don't understand the implications of what alliance with the caliphate and the implications of jihad really are.
No, certainly. And so in terms of looking at this sort of main strategy, so Kressenstein and Jamal Pasha are preparing this army to strike down against Suez, because obviously they want to cut the British Empire in two. They want to separate the Asiatic possessions in India from the rest of the empire, therefore making them more susceptible to their jihad strategy. So, well, fortunately for the British, because again, we've sort of alluded to in these Meeting passages that a lot of the Germans were really sort of excited or even ecstatic to take part in this whole operation. Well, the Germans are rather loose-lipped, and the British spies were able to capture a lot of information. And make adequate preparations. So when the Ottomans and Germans were preparing the strike on the Suez Canal, the British knew it was coming, which was a bit of a silly mistake on their parts. And another issue that doesn't help is because there are gaps in the Berlin-Baghdad Express between the Taurus and Amadus Mountains around where Kilikia in Turkey connects into Syria. These logistical problems lead to a long delay in the operation to attack being launched, so that doesn't help them either. And so what the Germans and Ottomans try to do is this got mentioned earlier, they try to encourage a couple of smaller uprisings to sort of support this offensive against Suez, where they believe if we can get the British to be distracted elsewhere, they'll make our attack on the Suez Canal even more unlikely to succeed. And so the main way they do this is they send Otto Mansmann to encourage the Senussi in Libya to rise up and attack British in Egypt. And however, he puts it off for a couple of years because he doesn't have sufficient supplies. That's Sheikh Ahmed al-Sharif, the leader of the order. They also send a fellow called Leo Frobenius to the Hejaz to try and rally the tribesmen of Arabia to launch an attack on the Horn of Africa. However, that ends up leading nowhere either. And Frobenius, on his way back to Constantinople, ends up being captured by the British and ends up spilling the beans, so that one goes nowhere. But another operation they do is really interesting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but I've got a figure here on there called Alois Musil, and what's interesting about him is that if history had gone differently, he could have been a Central Powers equivalent of Lawrence of Arabia. So for those who don't know, Musil was a Czech Orientalist, and he'd actually spent years of his life traveling throughout Arabia. So he was actually very experienced with the region and its people. And it was interesting, despite obviously with his nationality being Czech, he was nominally obviously a subject of the Habsburgs. But it should be noted that when he engages on his mission to take part in the sort of jihad in the region, it's in the employ of the Germans, not Austria. The Austrians sort of had no interest in this jihad strategy. They had other things to worry about. So the reason Musil is important is that, so this map I've got here on the right, this is from the Armistice of Mudros, which is end of October 1918, when the war was over pretty much, but it's useful in terms of looking at Arabia. So you'll see in the middle there, you've got the Emirate of Nejd and Masa. This is the territory of Ibn Saud and the Saudis. Then to the north, you've got the Rashidi Emirate, which are the Emirate of Hale. They're a vassal of the Ottomans. And then to the north, you've got the land of An-Nafud. This has got various other sort of Arab tribes. And the most important tribe in this region are the Rawala Bedouins. And the leader of the Rawala Bedouins is a fellow called An-Nuri ibn Shalan. And this is someone Musil had met many years ago and actually befriended. And what's also important is Nuri was also friends with Ibn Saud. And so what the Germans want to do with Musil is send him off to Arabia, get him to strike up a grand sort of alliance of the Bedouin tribes of the Rawala and the Saudis to take part in the jihad, because for the strike on Suez, they need camels from the Arabs for supplies, but they also want the ferocious Bedouin warriors, and especially the Saudis who practice Wahhabism, which is this more radical warlike sect of Islam. You know, you can't imagine anything more perfect if you want to wage Islamic jihad. So, so you want to say something?
No, I was just saying that Wahhabism is another iteration of. I think they prefer to be called Salafist, but Wahhabism is ubiquitous in terms of our Western understanding. I was just going to mention the fact that yes, it makes sense to employ the Saudis against the Hashemites, but then one has to consider that the Saudis were the traditional enemies of the Ottomans as well. So you're just bringing about all of these further contradictions in terms of making these friends during the moment of emergency during the war. But your whole notion of, again, from the Ottoman point of view, this is just you actually creating an enemy which could be used as a sword against you. And ultimately, it should be mentioned that the Saudis were the ones to unite Central Arabia, and they still rule Central Arabia to this day. But also it should be mentioned, just from a point of view of geography, the idea that the Saudis and the other sort of lesser Bedouin tribes could have seriously mounted an operation into the Sinai Peninsula is just nonsense. It took a huge amount of, again, personal heroism from T. Lawrence and the sort of harnessing of the power of the Hashemites to be able to just attack Aqaba, which was nowhere near the Suez Canal. It should be mentioned. They didn't even have to cross the Sinai Peninsula. It was just on the periphery of the extreme northwest of what you can see on this map here with the region in brown. So it seems again that even though Lawrence of Arabia was a complete, you can almost say it transcended any serious British involvement or engagement. It was just a fluke. Militarily speaking, it was a sideshow of a sideshow, to quote the famous film. Whereas for the Saudis to ever attack the Sinai Peninsula, we have to say that would be a tenfold less likely than what we had with Lawrence of Arabia. So I hate to go back to my point again, but it just seems that these are policy considerations made up by dreamers.
No, that's certainly fair, but there is, I think, one pragmatic element I want to salvage from this, which is that the main reason the Saudis were the enemies of the Ottomans was because the Ottomans were propping up the Rashidis, who were the Saudis' mortal enemies. And, Enver Pasha was sending, lots of weapons, money to the Rashidis. And ultimately, Musil, when he comes here, he didn't really even have faith in his own mission, because he realized that if the Ottomans want to consolidate this region, they're going to have to betray the Rashidis. They're going to have to throw them under the bus and allow the Saudis and the Rawala to partition and destroy them. By that way, you could then bind their loyalty to you, because you've just helped deliver their rivals to them and help consolidate the control of this region. And so, however, Oppenheim and Enver Pasha are like, no, you mustn't betray the Rashidis. No, you must somehow persuade the Rawala, the Saudis, and the Rashidis to all get along fine, and it ultimately goes nowhere. And you're very much right that, yes, a Saudi attack on the Suez Canal would have been ridiculous. But ultimately, as I said, it was about consolidating the region, because I think, obviously, later on in the war, when you have the Arab revolt by Hussein and the Hejaz, I think Hussein would have fought twice had he known that all the Arab tribes of Arabia were loyal to or allied with the Ottomans.
Yes, I think we're just sort of getting into a complete quagmire when we're talking about the nature of Bedouin alliances in Central Arabia, and it's really almost ridiculous that any sort of Western power can contrive a favorable outcome. Because it should be mentioned that even when we're talking about the British involvement, which was far more successful than the German involvement in this region, ultimately the Arabian plans turned out to be completely at variance with the British and the French plans. So all you're doing, even if there is a modicum of success, like the Hashemite seizure of the city of Aqaba, it creates a headache for you further down the line, which would have serious implications. So I'm just trying to think of, even if you do, by some miracle, unite all of these Central Arabian tribes, they're far more likely to want to attack the Ottomans than they are wanting to attack the British or even the Persians, as should be mentioned at this time. So it seems like you're committing a complete sort of own goal by consolidating an enemy, which will then go on to attack your ally, which you've already mentioned is already a problem. So yeah, I just think it's further holes in the sinking ship.
Mm. No, that's fair, because I was just thinking, because ultimately, after the war, the Saudis would conquer the Rashidis in 1921. So, if anything, the Ottoman protection of the Rashidis prolonged their survival until their conquest. So, I was just thinking of the Rashidis seemed more of a liability to the Ottomans than helping them. So, but yeah, I do get your point. It was a bit of a mess, that region.
Well, just think, what's the most favorable outcome? Okay, well, none of the tribes unite, and they all fight each other. Thereby, we basically cancel each other out. Well, again, that just completely exposes the jihad idea, doesn't it? That even if you have, say, for example, a Muslim rebellion, I think the best possible outcome you could have from the jihad idea is not India, because that was a complete fantasy. It would have been a regime change in Egypt, and it wouldn't have been the Ottomans taking over Egypt. It would have been the Khedive sponsoring some sort of rebellion. If, say, for example, the Italians were to err on the side of the Central Powers, and the Ottomans were, posed to potentially attack Suez, that the Khedive would form an alliance with the Germans in order to maintain the territorial integrity while keep kicking out the British. But even then, that was so beyond the realms of military sort of realizable sort of strategy throughout the entirety of the war. So really, you look at Arabia and just say maybe a miracle would happen, and that's essentially what happened for the British.
I know, certainly. And just want to address a comment from John, not real name, in the chat. I'm a bit confused by Ottoman relations in the Arabian Peninsula. I understand that they had the holy cities and Yemenish, but did not manage to control the rest of Arabia. Well, most of Arabia is a desert, and with the best will in the world, the Ottomans didn't really have, I think, the resources or the time, I think, willing to actually pacify it. Because to be honest, you've got to remember, this is before oil is discovered. So, maybe if the Ottomans...
The region was completely worthless apart from the seacoast until the 1930s. So even the first caliphates didn't bother to control it. It was very early into the Umayyad Caliphate where the Bedouin tribes just sort of broke off and were allowed to sort of be left to their own thing. The main consideration for Arabia wasn't controlling the interior, it was controlling the pilgrimage routes. But they tended to go to the city of Jeddah. You've already mentioned that there was a route to Muscat along the Omani coastline. There was a route to Aden, and Sana'a, I believe, is the capital city of Yemen, up to Jeddah, and ultimately to Mecca and Medina, and of course the route going south through Jerusalem to Aqaba. So that was the main consideration from the Muslim point of view, was maintaining these pilgrimage routes. But that's just the coastline, and the western part of Arabia go into the interior, and there's nothing there except desert.
And another point, actually, that undermines, I think, the whole idea of using the Bedouin to buttress your jihad. It should be noted that the Rawala Bedouin were not really that pious, and if anything, one of their main sources of income was harassing and holding up pilgrims on the road to Mecca and Medina. So that kind of, like Arab highwaymen, if you like. So yes, let's just get these opportunistic tribesmen on our side. Yeah, that's going to buttress our holy jihad.
Yeah, it's just... Yeah, we've already gone into why the Ottoman Caliphate is a bit of a misnomer. There's only so many times I think we can repeat it.
Fair point. So another comment from John, not real name. Why is Islam so tied to Arabs? Arabs are not allowed to be enslaved if the caliphs cannot even control it. No, my understanding is that Muslims can't be enslaved, not just Arabs.
No, this is. We're going into the whole roots of the creation of Islam, but the major success of Islam is that the Prophet was able to unite the Muslim tribes to fight off external enemies. First of all, it was the pagan and other sort of Gnostic cults, and even the Christians within Arabia, which people seem to forget about. That there were Christian Arabians long before there were Muslim Arabians. And then you were able to unite the Arabs in opposition to the Romans and the Sasanians, the Persians. But once those enemies had been defeated, there was no reason from an empire which had now moved outside of Medina, was the first capital, had now moved outside of Medina and established a capital at Damascus and later Baghdad. There was no need to control the interior of these Bedouin tribes. Now they basically served their purpose for Arabia, which was to defeat all these other powers. And from that point on, with what I've already mentioned concerning the control of the ports and the pilgrimage routes, the economic and population centers were in Mesopotamia and the Levant, not in the interior of Arabia. So these regions basically politically lapsed.
No, certainly, thank you. And I see John, not real name's got another comment. As much as I'd like to address that, John, I don't want to get too bogged down in Arab ethnography and Islamic history too much in this stream. Maybe another time. Right. So, also, did you want to say something?
No, I think you're wise to do that, I think.
Yeah, otherwise I think we'll be here for hours. So, Yeah, so in terms of looking at the actual campaign to attack Suez, so ultimately they're able to assemble an army of about 20,000 men. And so this is in a sort of early 1915, about January time. And so they've been able to get the necessary supplies to launch the attack. However, this attack against Suez is a failure. They're not able to break through. The only good thing about it is they're able to retreat in good order, only losing a few hundred men out of 20,000. So, however, we're going to be talking about military disasters that's around this time. You've, of course, got in the northeast, Enver Pasha loses the Battle of Sarikamish to the Russians, where he loses a quarter of his army to cold and attrition, and then like another quarter through the course of the battle itself, and then is forced to retreat in humiliation. And so obviously the Ottoman Empire is in this sort of great crisis, and it's from this point we obviously have the Gallipoli campaign, where the British and French obviously want to try
I
and
think if it's all right, we need to belabor this point a little bit more, because obviously the focus of your discussion has been on the non Kaiser jihad, but the Battle of Sarikamish was something I would say far more existential compared to the attack on Suez, because during the Ottoman-Turkish War, what you can say really infuriated the Turkish nationalists who would later take power is not necessarily the fact that we're losing control over the Balkans, in particular during that war. It was the case of Bulgaria. Rather, it was we were losing Turkish Muslim-dominated territories in what we basically now know as the actual borders of Turkey in the extreme east towards Batumi and the Armenian highlands. And so the whole premise, like I said, of Enver Pasha's scheme was to entertain these German dreams, but to target the campaign through the Caucasus to Baku and later on to Bukhara. So the Battle of Sarikamish had already sort of confirmed a very sort of damning trend for these goals, which is that the Russians keep expanding into the area, which seems to almost, from the point of view of the Turkish nationalists, to be the jugular vein of a would-be Turkish state, because you show in that map, which shows the sort of rump of the Turkish Empire, which was still in control of Ottoman hands, the area in red. That area in red is the prime territory which the Ottomans want to maintain control over. As much of northern Mesopotamia as they can, but ultimately, if you shore off those areas in the south, that is more or less the borders of modern-day Turkey. And why Ataturk is so revered, because he was able to hold on to those territories, which also came at the expense of Russian and later Soviet territories in the Far East. So yes, we can talk about the whole nature of the German sort of jihad, but it is those territories. And again, you can say for the Ottomans it's even more of a humiliation, because the Germans had defeated the Russians so decisively at Tannenberg, and perhaps high of that victory from the Germans, that they can coordinate their campaigns through the Caucasus and win that victory. The fact that Turks failed to do is a real destruction of their ambitions in the early stages of the war before we get to Gallipoli.
No, certainly. Thank you for that elaboration. So, is in terms of discussing Gallipoli itself. So, obviously, this is critical because obviously the Ottomans are at a low point. So obviously, they've failed to take Suez, and they've had this disaster at Sarikamish, and obviously you've now got the Entente forces landing, trying to knock out Constantinople and hopefully close off this Eastern theatre. And what's interesting here is that this is an example of where I talked about Lehman Sanders earlier, but obviously he's the commander of the Ottoman First Army, and it was the main commander responsible for the defense of Gallipoli, in sort of strategically. And obviously he invested heavily in sort of getting more shore defenses, more guns in place, and and ultimately, yes, the victory of Gallipoli did lead to a significant number of Ottoman casualties. It led to more Entente casualties, and it was a great victory that was allowed the empire to carry on. And so again, just showing that this conventional strategy was bearing more fruits than these fantastical jihads off in Arabia or Afghanistan.
I mean, to be even more scathing of it, This almost seems like an Indiana Jones adventure, doesn't it? You know, oh, the Nazis want the Ark of the Covenant. The Nazis want the Holy Grail. But it's almost amazing that anyone took these things seriously.
No, certainly. And I've got Mustafa Kemal Bey, later Ataturk, on screen here. But if there's anyone else you can credit with the Central Powers victory at Gallipoli, it's him really, because it's him who's instilling morale in the troops as in this heavy fighting. No, I don't order you to fight, I order you to die. And so you almost the Ataturk legend is sort of born, and you can almost see as the idea of the Ottoman Empire as the Islamic empire that's going to wage jihad, that's failing. But the patriotic Turkishmen who are going to defend their land from foreign attack, that's a much more convincing identity, isn't it?
Well, convincing to what? It's very convincing to a late 19th century mindset where the Ottoman Empire and the whole basis of religion has in fact been superseded by a more national identity. The last sort of gasp of reasserting the religious identity over the national identity was the Hamidian alliances, which persecuted the Christians, but that in turn actually destroyed Ottomanism, really in its crib. And so what you're left with is, Muslim and later Turkish nationalism superseding that. And as so much of the Young Turks were built on ideas which were imported from the West over the course of the 19th century, it therefore germinates into this new ethnogenesis around the secular, Western-oriented, Latin alphabet using republic employing elements of etatism. I think it's the 7 arrows of Ataturkism. All of these things are completely anathema to the Kaiser Jihad.
No, certainly. And I think it might be fair to say that I think Ataturk's experience of the war probably was somewhat motivating, as when he was president, he killed off the caliphate for good in 1924.
Sorry, 6 arrows, just to correct myself.
Oh, and that's all right. Yeah, and ultimately why he killed off the caliphate, because I think he saw it more trouble than it was worth, and possibly a threat to his authority.
Yes, I mean, obviously you've looked into this far more than I have, but my theory has always been that Ataturk saw the caliphate as this lingering humiliation of Sevres, where the British and perhaps even other powers, even potentially the Soviets, were going to use the position of the caliphate in Constantinople. We have to also mention that this is a time where the Turks didn't exercise full sovereignty over the Straits. The caliph could have been used as a tool for this exact policy that we're mentioning, which is just stirring up trouble across Muslim regions throughout the world. And especially as Ataturk wanted to basically commit Turkey to a post-Islamic future, it made complete sense, not just in point of view of his secular ambitions, but from the point of view of asserting Turkish national sovereignty.
Certainly, and because we're talking about this idea of the caliphate, it should be important to note that von Oppenheim wanted to use the caliphate as a weapon against the British. Well, it should be noted that the British around this time were wanting to get their own caliph and to control Islam for themselves, and that was why they entertained the Hashemites and Hussein, because they kind of wanted to prop him up as a potential candidate. But
yes, they were, just to emphasize, these were the Sharifs. And I've already actually alluded to this. There is a possibility that Sharif Hussein could have been made the caliph because he could trace a more venerable lineage back to the Prophet than the Ottomans could.
Because he was a Sayyid, which is somebody who's descended from the Qurayshite descent, the clan that the Muhammad and his family belonged to.
Yes, and I think he could therefore inherit the title of Mirza, which basically is the Arab version of Prince of the Blood, so to speak, which the Ottomans couldn't. Like I said, they basically had to invent a genealogy to claim the caliphate.
No, certainly. But just to go back to this idea of a British caliphate, because another option that they were exploring, I think it's one you discussed in one of your streams, was that what if the Gallipoli attack had been successful and you knocked the Ottomans out of the war and the British now control Constantinople?
Sorry,
Or
again,
what?
just for the point again of correcting, you are completely correct that Mirza is the Persian rendering of Saeed. Sorry, as someone who's more familiar with Persian history than Arab history, but these are synonymous titles, so just confirm that.
And I did think that, but I didn't want to correct you too much. So, but that's fine.
By all means, correct me. It's for the sake of education and for the sake of the chat. It's far better than stepping over me in that regard. So please do so.
No, certainly. And so there's this idea that if the British had captured Constantinople, because it should also be noted that due to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the sort of Sazonov sort of addendum to that. By the way, I should also add, obviously I've been reading from McMeekin for our streams. Another book McMeekin wrote called The Ottoman Endgame, which is about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Something he hammers home in that book is that the idea of it being Sykes-Picot Agreement is ridiculous. It's the Sykes-Picot-Sazonov Agreement, and he won't let you forget the Russian sort of involvement in Sykes-Picot. And it should be noted that's part of the sort of Sazonov addendum to Sykes-Picot. The Russians were nominally promised the Straits, but I don't believe the British, if they'd captured it, would have handed it over. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Well, I've mentioned in a previous conversation that I agree with a lot of McMeekin in other areas compared to this. My contentious view is that the Russians bear the most responsibility for the First World War. And as a result of that, I've sort of earned the enmity of sort of many, czarist apologists and, monarchists in general for that view, even though, I stand by it because I believe it's the truth. But no, I think they had, and I believe Sazonov, he was the protege of Stolypin in the Russian Foreign Office. Sazonov, I think, who bears a lot of responsibility for the beginning of the First World War. He was responsible for the preemptive mobilization, or the quote-unquote secret mobilization on the 24th of July, if I remember correctly, 1914, which created the crisis, really. That created the crisis far more than the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo. But they had to concede that to the Russians. And I think if the Russians were able to assert a serious presence within the region, there's nothing that the British and the French could have done about it. That sort of leads to another question, which is counterfactuals regarding could the Triple Entente have survived a complete Entente victory? I believe it could not, but obviously that's not the scenario we live in.
And so again, in terms of the counterfactual, going back to this idea of what if the British had captured Constantinople, I could see a scenario. I mean, this especially would have happened, I think, with the Ottoman collapse. Had Ataturk and the Turkish nationalists not been as successful as they was, you could have had like a puppet caliph in Constantinople under the British.
Well, it all depends. I mean, obviously, the Gallipoli campaign was in 1915, and it was directed against Constantinople. Even if Constantinople fell, obviously it would have been a major, moral victory against the Ottomans. But I think it would have perhaps induced the Russians to stay in the war longer, because they could have held that over the British, that the British will give us Constantinople if we just stay in the war, just stay in the war. But alas, that never happened. So that possibility sort of never seriously came out after the defeat of Gallipoli. As for the British potentially controlling the Caliph, the funny thing about the House of Osman is that there was, as we mentioned previously, there was several attempts to establish primogeniture in the 19th century, but by and large, the Ottomans inherited based on something called agnatic seniority, which is also what the Saudis used to adhere to up until Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has, completely sort of upset that. And primogeniture also seems to be established in Saudi Arabia as a fact, if not a legal sort of reality. With the Ottoman Empire, that also meant that you could pick and choose any member of the House of Osman to be a caliph. And that was the case, is that the last sultan was not the last caliph. The sultan abdicated, and he also abdicated the caliphate. Do correct me, because I've actually forgotten all of this. But Bede, I'm very sorry. Was it Mehmed the Sixth?
Yes, it was Mehmed. Yeah, last
and
Caliph.
and Abdul Majid or Abdul Aziz was the last caliph.
Yeah,
Which,
Abdul Majid, I believe, was the last Caliph. Yeah.
yes, Abdul Majid was the last caliph. But that just proves my point. It proves my point that you can just find any member of the House of Osman, preferably one with agnatic seniority, and make him caliph, and imprison him in the Dolmabahce or the Topkapi in Constantinople, and then have a rival prince of the House of Osman or a secular republic, as we saw, waging war. And that's basically, I think, from the point of view of the Turkish National Assembly in Ankara, that is the reality that they thought they were facing already.
No, absolutely. And I just want to now look, because we mentioned it early when we were looking at the Saudis and the Rawalla in Arabia, but I want to look up the build up to the Arab Revolt and the Ottomans' relationship with the Hashemites, because it's quite intriguing, because as we know, the Hashemites essentially were trying to play both sides for the best deal, because obviously we've got Sharif Hussein in the middle, who's ruling in Mecca, and he's got his two sons. His older son Abdullah is off intriguing with the British in Egypt, and then he's got his younger son Faisal, who later would become Friends of Lawrence of Arabia and become king of Iraq. But Hussein was using Faisal essentially as a kind of representative at the Ottoman court for himself, and essentially using him to try and get what concessions he could out of the Ottomans, or placate them for long enough until he was ready to strike. And what's interesting is that von Oppenheim around this time, so this is in sort of second half of 1915, decides to go off to the Ottoman Empire, and he wants to travel around and whip up like a propaganda tour, because he's like, oh dear, the jihad isn't doing as well as I thought. Quick, we need more propaganda to perpetuate this jihad. And when's that happening is Oppenheim has a meeting with Faisal to try and sort of understand his intentions and see what could be worked out with them. And
it's just funny. It's just funny, We need more jihadis, more jihadis. It just sort of reminds me of like a Obama era foreign policy in the 2010s. We need more Muslim insurrectionists. Bring me more insurrectionists. Assad must go. Assad must go. Nothing ever changes.
No, it's just quick. Our strategy didn't work. Double down even more. Now it'll work.
Yes, we will have our glorious jihad. We need more jihadis. We need more jihadis.
Inshallah. But in a more serious,
inshallah, yeah.
But in a more serious note, Faisal ultimately was skeptical as to how much support the Ottomans could offer the Hashemites, and Oppenheim himself was rather skeptical of Faisal as to how committed the Hashemites would be. However, he still treated with Faisal because he believed that the Hashemites declaring a support for the Ottomans would, buttress the propaganda support of the jihad, considering it's now got the endorsement of the Sharif of Mecca. And it's just another reading I want to do from Meakin on this. Just going to pull up the page 1 moment. Okay. So with Abdullah already discredited in Turkish and German eyes because of his Cairo connections, Faisal had a better chance of protecting the family business at the port. With little or no trust left between his father and the Young Turks, his task was daunting. Faisal, however, had a secret diplomatic weapon in reserve, Baron Max von Oppenheim. Just as the Baron had been used by Abbas Hilmi to promote his case for the Egyptian throne with the German government, so too was Oppenheim potentially a valuable diplomatic asset for Hussein. In the good old days of Abdul Hamid, the future Sharif had wined and dined the impressionable young German social climber in his Bosphorus palace, making a predictably electric impression. The Baron had never forgotten the glamorous Hashemite prince of Mecca, and neither had Hussein forgotten the compliments Oppenheim had showered down upon him on behalf of the Kaiser. Baron Oppenheim, almost pretended naturally favourable by temperament and inclination to all things Arab, was an ideal intermediary for the Sharif of these suspicious young Turks. To help butter up the Baron, Faisal paid court to the German in Oppenheim's own room at the Pera Palace Hotel, thus reinforcing the Baron's pride of diplomatic placement. Faisal was accompanied to the hotel by his uncle Sharif Nasser, one of Hussein's brothers, who seemed to have been sent along as a check on Hussein's ambitious son. The meeting took place on Saturday morning, 24th of April 1915, the day before the widely anticipated British landings at last materialised. So this is just before Gallipoli. The coincidence of timing may explain why so little is known to this day about Faisal's charm offensive in Constantinople. The drama at Gallipoli immediately drowned out any public sensation which might have been produced by a reconciliation between the Porte and the Sharif. The pressing news from the nearby front notwithstanding, the Faisal-Oppenheim tete-a-tete was still a historic occasion. The prophet of global jihad, the Kaiser's personal envoy to his beloved Islamic world, had finally arrived in Constantinople to take personal charge of the Turco-German Holy War, and his first item of business was to win over a true prince of the blood. Faisal was no less attuned to the potential significance of the meeting, seeking to win through Oppenheim's offices Germany's support for Hussein's claim on the Sharifate, cutting the legs off CUP plans to replace him. The meeting proceeded with great amicability. Speaking in a mixture of Arabic and French, Faisal and Oppenheim exchanged the usual pleasantries, with Faisal taking particular care to emphasize the esteem in which his father held the Baron. The gushing personal compliments were predictable, but the political compliments were more interesting. I thank God, Faisal told Oppenheim, that the interests of Islam are entirely identical with those of Germany. It is true the Hashemite prince conceded that there was a difference in religion between Muslim countries and Germany, but material interests relative to this world, differences over religion should never stand in the way of these reciprocal interests. Despite Sheriff Hussein's outward show of amity with Great Britain, Faisal assured the Baron that the current alliance between Germany and Turkey is one which he had praised. Sacred was the Turco-German cause of his father, Faisal claimed, that upon witnessing its consecration with the Ottoman Holy War fetvas, Hussein had told him that if I die now, I would not have a single regret. And just as a quick interjection, we all know that this is a load of rubbish because while this is going on, Hussein is engaging in a series of correspondence with McMahon, the British Consul General in Cairo, the infamous McMahon Hussein correspondence, where they're negotiating what the terms of carving up the Ottoman Empire are going to be.
Well, this should also be noted that if this were real, this would be the only really substantive justification for the cause of global jihad. The spiritual alliance between these two forces, the reaffirmation of the subjection of the Sharif, and rebuttressing the idea that the Caliph, who is also the Sultan, and Dolmabahce is also the custodian of the two holy cities. But I'm going to give Sharif Hussein some credit and say that what upset all of these plans is the thing you've already alluded to, which were the Gallipoli landings, which made such an impression. It wasn't just inducing the Hashemites to form an alliance with the British, it was also inducing the Italians to switch sides as well. There was this genuine euphoria at the beginning of the Gallipoli landings that the Allies were going to win the war any day. So yes, they changed size, but you can also argue that, as with the Italians, they changed size prematurely.
Certainly. And just to continue, this was fine talk, but Oppenheim wanted more than assurances of moral support for the Holy War. What was needed, he emphasized again and again to Faisal, was a true union of Islamic peoples. Above all, there must be no talk of relocating the locus of spiritual power within the Sharifs of Mecca. The Ottoman Caliphate, Oppenheim insisted, must remain always the unique and central focus towards which all the eyes of all Muslims are directed. If the Ottoman Caliph did not retain control over the holy places, he warned Faisal, England would get her hands on Mecca and Medina, and thereafter on all Muslim countries. If they took control of the Hejaz, the infidel British would then be in a position to manipulate or suppress the sacred Mecca pilgrimage, and Oppenheim termed darkly, prevent the free exercise of your religion. It should thus, the Baron declared, be the duty of all Muslims, beginning with the Sharif and his Hashemite clan, to fight against English intrigues, to follow the commandments of the Ottoman Caliphate, and in this way safeguard the force and prestige of Islam. Faisal did not disagree with Oppenheim about the deleterious effects of British influence on the Hajj and on Islam more generally. Both the two men felt in common fundamental antipathy to Albion. Faisal did not likewise share the Baron's reverence for the primacy of the Ottoman Caliph, particularly now that the institution was the most powerless tool of the Young Turk government. The real purpose of Faisal's trip was probably to divine the intentions of Talat and Enver towards his father, whose spies had unearthed evidence that the Young Turks were planning to depose him. It was a delicate game between the Porte and Mecca in which both sides were proceeding with great caution. Hussein had so far refused to publicly endorse the Turco-German Holy War, despite a deluge of telegrams and emissaries from Constantinople, ostensibly for fear of inciting the British to blockade the Hejaz and starve his people. The Sharif's passivity was infuriating to Enver and Jamal, but if they sacked him in retaliation, it might throw the theological legitimacy of the Holy War into question. And so they waited for now. The Sharif, for his part, did connive in the dispatch of the Green Banner to Jamal's army in Jerusalem, but this was rather a cheap way of supporting the critical Suez Canal operation without sending troops. It was not likely to fool Jamal. Faisal's charm offensive with Oppenheim was never clever feint from the Sharifian side. Hussein knew perfectly well that the entire Holy War idea had been cooked up by the Baron and the Kaiser, with the Young Turks themselves playing along in order to harness German power to Ottoman interests. Faisal implicitly admitted this in his discussion with Oppenheim, in which he heaps bushels of praise on Germany and the Kaiser, while still avoiding the matter of the Ottoman claim to primacy in Islam. In a particularly brilliant manoeuvre, Faisal glossed over the sore subject of Mekazaka's support for the Porte during the Tripoli War, but chalking up Sharifian passivity to the despair his father had felt following the Italian invasion, because the misbehaviour of this erstwhile member of the Triple Alliance had, it seemed then, ruined the dream of an alliance between Germany and Islam. Missing this illusion of Sharifian treachery entirely, Oppenheim replied by chastising his own government for failing to condemn the Italians. The conversation then shifted onto the subject of Entente perfidies against Islam, which ground Faisal could not possibly get into trouble. Oppenheim himself was easy for a Hashemite prince to please, but to win the trust of Enver and Talat, Faisal would have to do better, and so he dropped hints throughout the conversation with the Baron that the Sharif would be turning over a new leaf. It was not that Hussein was reluctant to join in the jihad, rather that he would only do so if the Turks themselves took a more serious approach to the Holy War. Going on the offensive, Faisal reminded Oppenheim that the CUP had corrupted the purity of the holy places by establishing secular European-style schools in Mecca and Medina. Instead of teaching the languages of infidels to Arabs and visiting Hajj pilgrims, the Ottomans should proselytize the cosmopolitan population of Mecca to join the jihad. It was a clever counter-argument to the Ottoman charge of disloyalty, but to win over the Young Turks, Faisal would have to offer more than rhetorical tricks. What would the Sharif bring to the table? Careful as ever to not entrap his father by assenting to concrete obligations, Faisal told Oppenheim that Hussein was prepared to raise an army of Arab cavalry and other Bedouins to participate in a future attack on the Suez Canal, without specifying the size of this would-be striking force, nor the time frame in which it would be organised. Still vaguer was Faisal's promise to send emissaries to promote the jihad in Somalia and Sudan, and further afield in British India. Oh yes, we're going to have the Hashemites sending the Bedouin cavalry all the way to India and all the way to Egypt. And it's just incredible how much Oppenheim is being duped by Faisal here. Again, Oppenheim really is this like true believer in like pan-Islam, and it's the Young Turks are actually being more sensible in suspecting the potential treachery of the Hashemites.
Like I said, it reminds me of the dispensationalists and their attitude towards Israel since the late 19th century. They've always been far more enthusiastic than a lot of Jewish Zionists for this exact purpose. But even though you can chalk up and say, oh, well, the dispensationalists at least have a caveat in the sense that they believe that the creation of the Third Temple and the sanctification of Israel will bring about the second coming and the rapture from a Protestant point of view, or their weird Protestant point of view, whereas I can't understand any underlying sort of supernatural reason as to why Oppenheim would want to bring about Emir Faisal's cavalry forces in India. That to me seems completely insane, but there we are.
Well, I think as we've deduced, I think Oppenheimer was a bit of an insane individual. It's like, what? Bedouin cavalry, inshallah, how wonderful. We shall win.
Yes. We shall have the Hashemites in Bombay and Calcutta, and then we will move on to take over Shanghai and Tianjin, and then we will invade the United States. Well, why not? It just seems just so quite so ridiculous, but there we are. But anyway, Faisal is one of these interesting characters because he was basically a great sort of Machiavellian actor within the Hashemite house, because you've already mentioned Sharif Hussein. Faisal was only the third son of Sharif Hussein, and he was basically favored by the British and French because he was seen out of all of the scions of the Hashemite clan to be by far the most politically adroit and effective. And so it was very much a role that he cultivated at the expense of the other members of his family and directly appealed to the British. So that also needs to be credited to Faisal, along with Enver Pasha. All of these various nationalists and Muslim advocates were prepared to align certain policy goals and dupe their Western backers into promoting their causes.
No, certainly. And so we obviously keep making these funny impressions and mocking Oppenheim, but I've just had a thought, because obviously you did your review a couple of years ago on the death of Stalin, and I would love like a death of Stalin sort of black comedy, like covering all of this stuff, like with Oppenheim and Faisal. I think it'd be wonderful.
Yes, though I think there are only so many times that you can make the joke about uh, Arabian camelry forces and to whatever sort of far-flung field in order to operate them. I think you would need a whole sort of host of characters. I think, to be honest, it would have to revolve around the Kaiser. To be honest,
Oh,
would have
well,
to
no,
be
you
this.
get.
It would have to be this some sort of bizarre sort of comedy of errors where they're in Constantinople. You know, the fictitious event between the Kaiser and the Caliph and Enver Pasha and Sharif Hussein and Faisal. It would be anti-historical, of course, in Oppenheim, and they would all just be all the Germans would be jostling together about, oh, we fantasize that we're going to take over this place and that place and this place, and then we're going to have our ocean liners carried by von Barlin to go over to Sri Lanka and over to Malaya, and we're going to take Singapore. And then you just have, Sharif Hussein and Sultan Mehmed VI, stabbing each other in the back and plotting against each other, and then making secret entreaties to a comically over-exaggerated British and French stereotype, who they will also have, in Constantinople as spies. No, I can see that happening.
No, if only if only Armando Iannucci's listening to the stream, but we can hope.
To be honest, they wouldn't do it because it'd be far too offensive.
Oh yeah, good point. You were not allowed to be offensive anymore because that's funny, and we're not allowed to be funny anymore. But so in terms of building up to the actual Arab revolt, so well, fundamentally, what I think ends up what happens is Jamal Pasha is very suspicious of Hussein, and what he ends up doing is that he wants to send like a propaganda unit down to Yemen, and what Hussein sees in this is he sees it as an excuse for the Ottomans to send an armed convoy into his territory and to essentially keep watch on him, and obviously not wanting to potentially be arrested or held prisoner. I just think he calls their bluff and launches the revolt ultimately. And I think it's worth also just exploring the reasons other than that, because it was mentioned there by Faisal in the conversation with Oppenheim about the secularization of education. The Hashemites were greatly offended that the Young Turks set up secular schools in Mecca and Medina, which you can understand why, obviously being complete sacrilege. But also another point is the thing that Hussein was really upset about was the deposition of Abdul Hamid, because as we talked about last time, Abdul Hamid was the last sort of great sultan of the Ottoman Empire and someone who was really invested in his role as, seriously invested in his role of caliph and as the titular leader of the Islamic world. And so, despite what a film like Lawrence of Arabia would tell you, Hussein and the Hashemites, when they justified the Arab revolt, it wasn't some secular nationalist uprising. They characterized it as their own holy war, and that the Ottomans are, they have disgraced the name of Islam, and so we are the rightful true Muslims, and we're going to put the world to rights by destroying them.
Yes, it's this friction that existed everywhere. I mean, obviously, we're anticipating the arrival of sort of the Arab Renaissance movement in the late 19th century. I've already mentioned all of these nationalisms that were invented more or less in the 19th century, and they're permeating everywhere where there was Western influence, even China. And so, we have like a new secular education movement in Central Asia as part of the Russian Empire around the city of Tashkent. So yes, everywhere you can say Muslims with an ounce of fidelity are focusing on this act of secular sacrilege. And of course, from the point of view of these Muslim rulers, if the Ottoman Empire were just using the caliphate idea to appease the Germans, but the whole sort of trajectory of the Young Turk nationalist movement was towards what we basically see as Ataturkism, which I think is a fair impression that figures like like Sharif Hussein would have been given from them, especially if you're going to take the attitude from McMeek and Sirisi from the last conversation, whereby the British were concerned that the Young Turks were going to inaugurate a pan-European Judeo-Masonic conspiracy against the colonial empires. Then yes, if they were thinking anything along these lines, they may consider that the Turks would use them as useful idiots and then abolish them.
No, absolutely. And what I want to talk about next is I've been alluding to it, but I want to talk about the whole Afghan episode because it's actually interesting because there's a strong breakdown in relationship between the Germans and Ottomans over the Afghan episode, especially the situation in Iran, which the German mission under Niedermeyer has to go through. And just to give a bit of context, so Iran at this time was essentially a split protectorate between the British and Russians. The Russians are in the north and the British are in the south. And because Persia, Iran borders the Ottoman Empire, even though Iran is not nominally at war with the Central Powers, because its territory is militarily occupied by Entente forces, there was a back and forth conflict over the border region. So the Ottomans, the city of Hamadan, which is in Iranian Kurdistan, goes back and forth between the Ottomans and the Russians at several points. And what sort of is a bit contradictory is that the Germans, believing that they need to sort of link up with Afghanistan, because Iran is predominantly a Shiite nation, they believe they need to get the blessing of the Shia for the jihad as well. And so what they end up doing is a mission is sent to the mullahs of Karbala in southern Iraq. And for those who don't know, Karbala is the holiest site in Shia Islam because it's the site of the Battle of Karbala, where the third Shia Imam, Hussein, the son of Ali, was martyred. And so they send their mission, Captain Fritz Klein, and what they do is they get the local Sheikh Ali of Karbala's blessing for the jihad. But in order to do this, they have to give him an annual salary of 50,000 marks because the Sheikh had gotten his salary via Shia Muslims in India donating to him. But because this came via the British diplomatic offices, obviously if he did this, he would have his income cut off. So he would only agree to tacitly support the jihad if the Germans agreed to fund his salary instead, which they do. And it's just, again, another silly example that the Germans are spaffing money up the wall on these symbolic gestures. And this doesn't really do anything to help win Iran over, because despite the fact that you could argue, well, Iran should be naturally sympathetic towards the Central Powers because they're occupied by the Central Powers' enemies, the Russians and the British. The Ottomans are undermining this because the Ottomans have especially the Young Turks, have their own territorial aspirations for Iran. They are pan-Turkics. They want to annex Tabriz. They want to annex Iranian Azerbaijan to then link up with the Transcaucasian Russian territories and then onto Central Asia. So that's going to piss the Iranian nationalists off. And what doesn't help, but the local Ottoman commander, Rauf Bey, is particularly brutal in his occupation of Iranian territories, having several women that sort of raped and murdered, and there's lots of pillaging and foraging going on, which devastates and leads to famine and disease. And so this completely undermines any aspect, because the Germans actually had a coup where the local consul in Tehran, with some leaders of the Iranian opposition, were trying to launch a coup where they'd get Ahmad Shah, the ruler of Iran, to launch like a pro-German coup. But this fails because, one, a lot of their support's undermined by the Ottoman atrocities, but also because Ahmad Shah was a bit of a wimp and ultimately chickened out at the last minute. And it's in the backdrop of all of this that you've got Niedermeyer sort of traveling through. But while he's doing that, another officer under him, a certain Vasmus, is going off and launching his own jihad. He's running around Iran and he's arming and giving guns to various tribes. I mean, on the right here, I've got a map of the Persian Gulf territories between Khuzestan and Bushehr, and these are all the tribes that the Germans gave money and weapons to, and just got them to go around fighting pro-British tribes such as the Bakhtiari, which helped pacify the Khuzestan region where Britain had the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and the site at Abadan. And it should be noted that one of the few successes the Ottomans and Turks get in this, so the Ottomans and Germans get in this region, is they actually are able to launch a sabotage mission on Abadan, which actually knocks it out for a couple of months. So that costs the British millions of gallons in oil. And so, one counterfactual would be, what if the Ottoman-German efforts had been more successful here? Perhaps they could have seriously hampered the ability of the Royal Navy to have operated during the war.
I mean, my contention was actually going to be, trying to steelman the German position. Obviously, you have done a series of presentations on von Lettow-Vorbeck. The best sort of scenario really for the Germans would be to form makeshift armies of irregulars led by German officers, and basically form a series of counterinsurgencies and wars all across these various areas in the British Empire for essentially the same purpose that Lettow-Vorbeck was accomplishing in German East Africa, which was to pin down very large armies, imperial armies, the British Indian Army, for example, or the British and Russian occupation forces in Iran, etc., um, against far, far smaller forces. I mean, I forget exactly the numbers, the ratio of men that Vorbeck, say, for example, deployed against the British, and I believe the British even brought the Portuguese into the war because, as an extension, essentially, of the Vorbeck campaign, thereby detracting from potential troops who could be sent to the front lines in Western Europe. I think, again, from an idealistic point of view, that would have been the ideal German strategy.
No, I've seen the effectiveness of it. The only problem I have is that ultimately you're sending Niedermeyer off to Afghanistan, and my point is, well, you need to consolidate Iran first. So I think they should have invested more in securing the Iranian territories, getting more of the tribes on side and consolidating it. And if you can't capture Abadan, at least completely knock it out of commission to hinder the British naval effort. And then maybe if you're able to pacify Iran, then maybe push on to Afghanistan.
I mean, obviously, you are by far and away a better expert on the Qajaris than I, who only has a very sort of superficial understanding of them. So you would understand the potential implications or the possibility regarding a Qajari flip, essentially, to enable this strategy to go ahead. What I will say is that I want to buttress your previous argument about the territorial claims of the Ottomans on the Azeri populations, because again, people tend to forget the modern borders of Iran are by no means an ethno state. Only about 60% of the population are Persian. The second largest minority by far are Turkic Azeris, the same population that we see in the nation of Azerbaijan. And so the Turks obviously had designs, and they regularly, as you've already mentioned, encroached upon Iranian sovereignty in order to wage war in those territories and rape and pillage. By the same extension, if the Ottomans are going to appeal to the Sunni Caliphate, then they're going to want to claim the Sunni Arab populations in Khuzestan. So by extension, any attack on the Persian coastline would invariably mean a threat against Persian territorial integrity. So I think, again, just from my very superficial understanding, this really would be a struggle for the fate of Iran as a state at all. This could, if it went wrong, it could be potentially disastrous and herald an even worse timeline of events for Iran than we actually currently see for the 20th century.
Oh, no, absolutely. And at some point in the near future, I will do a stream on Iran in the Great War and how much of it of a national disaster it was for the country. And you're right, AM. As bad as it was, it could have been a lot worse for Iran. And in terms of the Qajari flip, I think the problem is Ahmad Shah, who was the last of the Qajar Shahs, he was incredibly weak-willed, and the constitutional revolution that overthrew his father, Muhammad Ali Shah, had completely cut the Qajar monarchy. I mean, all of the allowances of the Qajar princes were cut off by the Majlis, the parliaments, and so the Qajar monarchy at this point was a bit of a dead man walking. It was, I think, only, in fact, the only real military force in Iran was the Persian Cossacks, which was obviously led by Russian officers, and so the only real effective military unit is under Russian control. So I think the only real way you possibly could have is if Ahmad Shah had fled into the Ottoman and German territory and then was essentially forcibly reinstalled back on his throne by a invading army.
Which is why you see these ridiculous images of the Persian military in Circassian outfits.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, and so just to quickly talk about the actual Afghan mission. So obviously Niedermeyer spends months traveling through, and the British are actually onto him because they try to establish a cordon in the eastern part of Iran to try and block him from passing through, but this fails to catch him. And so Niedermeyer ends up eventually getting to Afghanistan, and he finally makes it to Kabul in about August 1915. However, his mission is undermined because several months before, Enver Pasha had already sent his own emissaries to try and negotiate a pact with the Emir Habibullah of Afghanistan. However, Habibullah, the main reason Enver was interested in talking to him is he wanted the Afghans to attack Russia, obviously to precipitate this sort of conquest of Central Asia. However, Habibullah is not interested in attacking Russia. And so that ends up falling through. And ultimately, I'm very sorry, I made a mistake. I've got my countries mixed up. So Habibullah is the Britain is his protector. It's a protectorate. So he was happy to attack Russia because, you know, because if he attacked Britain, he would have lost his annual subsidy from them. So he thought, well, if I attack the Russians, I won't lose my subsidy. Now, I'm sort of questionable as to that belief because the Russians are Britain's allies, so surely Britain still would have cut off his subsidy anyway had he attacked another member of the Entente alliance. But ultimately, when the Niedermeyer gets there, Habibullah ends up getting Niedermeyer to agree to this ridiculous treaty where, oh yes, we'll attack India. Yes, but you have to give us, you know, a extraordinary amount of guns and money, and yeah, if you can ship it all the way here, yeah, we'll launch a jihad for you. The only problem is that you've got Persia, which is this complete bedlam in the middle, and I should need to remind the audience that Persia at this time has almost no railroad infrastructure, and of course the Berlin-Baghdad Express in the Ottoman Empire is not even finished. So how on earth are you going to ship this inordinate amount of military material all the way to Afghanistan? I mean, it's a complete joke.
Another little point I want to raise about the ridiculous aspects of the politics of this region is that the most powerful ruler in Central Asia, excepting the Emir of Afghanistan, was Syed Mir Muhammad Ali Khan, who was the Emir of Bukhara within the Russian Empire. It was a protectorate. When the war broke out, I believe he also claimed to be a caliph. So again, it's just the diffusion and centralization of all claiming these religious authorities against each other.
No, certainly, and it's also interesting because if I recall correctly, didn't he lead an uprising against the Soviets later on?
Well, I think it's less that he was raising a uprising against the Soviets, more that he was trying to hold on to his authority against the whims of the Soviets, because he was the most sort of powerful ruler within that region who could have seriously prevented the Soviets from continuing their incursions. However, as per the White Movement in general, these were all decentralized and ultimately isolated groups of opposition towards the Soviets. And so by the 1920s, the Soviets have basically been able to provide conditions for an army, a new, modern, well-equipped army, allying with the young Bukharan movement, if I remember correctly. So they were essentially aligning with these quote-unquote secular Turkic organizations, which I've alluded to, who were sympathetic towards the goals of left-leaning republicanism, if not all-out communist revolution. And so he was deposed. But who was fighting alongside him during this was none other than Enver Pasha himself.
Oh, no, certainly, thank you. And okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was one of these other like weird sideshows. Was the attempt to, well, the actual uprising of the Senussi in Libya and invading Egypt. And so, for those who don't know, the Senussi were this very old order that had been in Libya for centuries at this point. They were an order of Sufis, which are essentially like Islamic mystics, and so the Ottomans had been courting them since the original rulers of that territory before they lost it to Italy. And it's interesting because the Sayyid Ahmed al-Sharif, the Sheikh of the order, was actually very reluctant to get involved for understandable reasons, because one, he's already fighting the Italians, but two, he actually considered Enver Pasha and the Young Turks as traitors, because when the Ottomans handed over Libya to Italy, the Sunufi order wanted to keep fighting, and ultimately, Enver Pasha and the Young Turks said, "Oh, sorry, we're bailing, we can't win." And it should also be noted that one of the reasons the Young Turks negotiated that peace was because the week before you had the outbreak of the First Balkan War, so they were understandably trying to cut their losses and think, right, we can't win here, let's redeploy and try and hold on to our Balkan territories. But the Senussi order understandably saw that as a betrayal. And so now when you've got the Ottomans coming back a couple of years later saying, "Oh, please invade British Egypt for us," they're rightly sceptical.
Indeed.
Okay. And so what ends up happening here is interesting, because both the Germans and the Ottomans send their own representatives. You've got Otto Felix Mansmann goes over as an advisor. You've also got Nuri Pasha, who was actually Enver Pasha's half-brother. He actually fought in the campaign during the original Italo-Turkish War, and he actually stays in Libya for several years as kind of like an Ottoman representative with the Senussi. And he ends up being able to eventually persuade Ahmed al-Sharif in 1916 to eventually attack British Egypt, and it's initially successful. They're able to overrun several villages and distract enough British divisions, but ultimately it's a failure. And the reason it's a failure is because what the Ottomans and Germans ideally should have done is launch the second attack on Suez from the east whilst this uprising was going on in the west. But the problem is, due to the deleterious supply situation with the railway in Syria, they just couldn't get enough supplies together, and that they felt confident enough to launch another attack. And so, I mean, I can kind of see where they're coming from, but ultimately, I think it was a mistake, because later on, in 1916, the Ottomans would attempt to launch a second attack on Suez, and this attack was even more of a disaster than the first one, because they lost half the army and had to retreat in disgrace, and this paved the way for the later British Palestine campaign in 1917. And so ultimately, yes, you could argue that the supply situation wasn't ideal, but surely the best time to have attacked Egypt is while you've got this the Senussi order causing havoc in the British backlines.
I mean, I would say there's an argument to be made that the Ottomans and the Germans shouldn't have advocated for this strategy, and they should have been husbanding their resources on the other side of the Sinai. Because the Sinai is a very difficult desert in order to cross and wage a war effectively, as the Israelis understood recently during the Yom Kippur campaign. They originally established a border at the Suez, but then willingly withdrew to the modern day borders of Israel. And so I really think the only way of attacking the Suez would have been to attack via the sea. And due to obviously we talked about the purchases of German ships for the Ottoman Navy. The German Ottoman naval presence was not sufficient to be able to ever seriously threaten the Italo English French naval presence in the Mediterranean. The only thing you could again perhaps include in there is the Austrian Navy, but the Austrian Navy wasn't able to seriously break out of the Adriatic and wage an effective war against the Italians out of the Straits of Otranto. So that would be my major contribution. I think this plan was folly without having achieved naval superiority in the region.
And no, fair point. And the Ottoman Navy, buttressed by the Breslau and the Goeben, it was good enough to deal with the Russians in the Black Sea, but a far cry from what they needed in the Mediterranean against the British, certainly. And yeah, like I went over with Lehman Pasha's view earlier, what they probably should have done is just focused on entrenching what they had, and if they ever saw an opportunity to strike without much loss, that would have made sense. But I kept alluding to the supply issues with the Baghdad railway, and that is largely connected to the Armenian genocide. And one thing I want to discuss is, because something that comes up a bit in the discussion around the German-Ottoman alliance is, to what extent is Germany responsible for this catastrophe? And I'm going to, from my understanding, I would say if the Germans are responsible, it's an indirect responsibility rather than a direct one, though that does not assuage any moral culpability for what happened. So just to elaborate a bit more, so with the construction of the railway, the main reason Abdul Hamid had agreed to it originally was because he wanted it to allow him to better deploy his troops in case of ethnic uprisings and to pacify regions such as Armenia. And so there's that angle. But later in the war, because you mentioned Sarah Kamish earlier, but it's really in the wake of Sarah Kamish and the alleged Armenian treachery that the three pashas decide on the course of genociding the Armenian population. And what they do is they essentially employ that this is old Turco-Islamic concept. I think it's pronounced mudasir, which is the forced internment and removal of populations. And so this is what they do with the Armenian populace at large: is they exterminate and or remove them from Armenia and forcibly march them through the Syrian desert and etc. And so this is to do with the railway for a couple of reasons. One, the Turks largely relied on the railway for achieving this practice of mudasir. So then there's that angle of culpability. The Germans directly financed the tools from which the Ottomans used to commit this tragedy. But another reason is that, ironically, the Armenian genocide actually badly hindered the completion of the railway, because most of the specialist workers, like metal workers and blacksmiths and etc., that worked on the railway from the local communities employed by the Germans were actually Armenians. And so with the genocide, they ended up driving away all the specialized workforce, which even more hinders the completion of the gaps in the supply. So, to use the term by Meekin, this completely gums up the work, so to speak, and is one of the reasons why there's such terrible supply and logistics situation ultimately. I mean, what's your view in respect of German culpability for the genocide?
Well, this is a very serious question, and it's one that Turkey to this day refuses to acknowledge. And as a result, you have a bizarre sort of counter historiography from the point of view of the Turkish government, which absolves them of any culpability or acknowledgement. However, this situation, I'm never a fan of using the indirect argument that it is, the weapons manufacturers or the engineers who are responsible for the actions of people who use them, because that's basically the argument for gun control in the United States. It's not people who kill, it's guns that kill. So that argument doesn't hold much weight to me. I think, as I've tried to illustrate elsewhere and present my views on this topic, I think the Ottoman Empire, the reason it was so successful for so long is managing relations with not only non-Turkic but non-Muslim populations. Within the hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire up until the 19th century, the Greeks came first, followed by the Armenians. The Armenians had international and commercial connections which were really useful to the Ottomans. And you're even alluding to here that even with the logistic situation, the Armenians had a very important role to fulfill, and they represented a significant population. We're talking about in excess of 5 million Armenians in that region. And so from the point of view, again, of the Ottomans, this has been a policy. I mean, just to look at that image on the left, that image isn't in reference to the First World War. I believe that image is in reference to the bloody massacres of the Bloody Sultan in the late 1890s. So this had been a campaign which had been ongoing, and it was ongoing because of the breakdown in the traditional political structure of the Ottoman Empire, which relied on passing these relationships between these subjugated peoples and exploiting whatever usefulness they could for the empire. Instead, as the empire retreated into a more isolationist, Islamic, and ultimately ethnic composition, all of the other peripheral nationalities, whether it be the Armenians or any of the European populations, which were ultimately sundered in the Balkans War, with the exception of the region around Edirne, became potential fifth colonists. Even if you're going to look at a situation where the Ottoman Empire remained preferentially neutral to Germany, it wouldn't. I don't believe there is a situation where an unscrupulous ruler like an Enver Pasha may have committed some great atrocity or relocation of his own accord as a preemptive strike against any attempts by the Russians to provoke the Armenians into an uprising to facilitate their entry into the war effectively. We're talking about this whole idea of the Germans using an Ottoman caliphal jihad against the um, European powers, the European colonial powers, whereas the Russians were equally intent, and as you can almost expect with the French and the Levant, to use those populations as potential fifth colonists within the Ottoman Empire. The whole gambit works both ways. And the Ottomans, ultimately, as we saw with Sarikamish, did exactly that. They saw that their unexpected defeat was as a result of treachery, the stab in the back behind the lines, and so they committed those populations to horrific conditions as per a policy which had been going on for, at that point, about 40 years. And it's not just the Armenians, it's also the Sifo, the putting to the sword of the Assyrian Christian, the Syriac Christian populations. There are around 500,000 deaths from the Sifo, and it was only actually as a result of a Austro-German intervention that spared the remnant of that population from complete extermination. With the Armenians, it's slightly higher. I believe it's anything in excess of 2 million. Again, I don't have these numbers in front of me, so I may be wrong. But take the Russians, for example. After the Crimean War, the Russians were concerned that the Circassians were of dubious loyalty. This was a population to the northwest of the Caucasus in the Kuban region, just adjacent to the Crimea and on the border with the Ottoman Empire. So the Russians committed the same policy which you just alluded to regarding the Ottomans, the forceful elimination and relocation of an entire nation of the Circassians from Russia to the Ottoman Empire. And as a result, the Ottoman Empire embraced a large Circassian population, and basically the Circassian elements that were still in Russia were absorbed into the Cossack regiments, hence why Cossack dress is actually erroneously referred to as Cossack dress and not Circassian dress. So I look at this as the overall tragedy leading up to the First World War. I don't view this as a situation where Germany has any unique culpability, because in order for Germany to have any sort of unique culpability, it would have to be a direct accessory to the crimes. The only alternative, essentially, is if the European powers, as a result of, you can almost say, a supernatural moral temperament and involvement in foreign policy as moral clarity, which I'm afraid never manifests, were able to achieve some sort of peace for the world. And I don't believe that. Obviously, we're talking about complete fantasy in other ways. We talk about the fantasy of a spontaneous uprising of all Muslims across the colonial empire. I think a scenario in which we have a war which ends in the dissolution of four great European empires, the Russians, the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottoman Empire, to not have these simmering conflicts brought to the fore and result in complete, utter human catastrophe is something that you would be incredibly naive not to expect. In the Ottoman Empire, you can say it's the worst example. You have other examples within the Russian Empire itself in the course of the First World War, huge human relocations populations, especially in the Western regions, which were vacated towards the Germans. And then when we get to the Second World War, we simply see an intensification of these conflicts. So unfortunately, it is simply the result of decades of breakdown and mistrust and political failures. I don't see how the Germans have unique culpability. And like I said, if you include what I mentioned about the Sifo, I would say that the Germans were the only moderating factor for the Turks, because as I've also mentioned in the stream, the French were by that same extension partially responsible for the mass starvation of the Lebanese Christian population due to the blockade. And it should also be mentioned, therefore, that the British were responsible for the mass civilian deaths within Germany as a result of their own hunger blockade. The more you look into this, the more the human calamity just unveils and manifests in these atrocious ways for the sake of continuing and achieving total victory.
No, certainly, and thank you for that elaboration. I mean, to be honest, ahead of the stream, I hadn't quite made my mind up on the idea of German culpability on this, so I was more speculating, if I'm being honest with you, because obviously it's a great human tragedy, and one doesn't want to just go around pointing the finger ultimately. But in terms of this pamphlet I've got on the left, so this was
Well,
Armenian
again,
propaganda.
that's not to say you can't point the finger of culpability. I'm not trying to say the Turks weren't fully responsible for these actions. I'm saying it forms part of a historical trajectory which contributes to these decisions. But I also don't want to say that this passes into the realms of historical inevitability, where it was simply ordained by the gods of history and time that these events must occur. Because that in a way is a form of sort of moral cowardice where you're absolving actors for their appalling decisions. But I'm saying when it comes to the Germans, that isn't clear.
No, certainly. And just to clarify, so this pamphlet I've got on the left, so this was propaganda that was created in support of the Armenians, and so this is kind of where the sentiment comes from. This idea that Wilhelm and the Germans are culpable, but as you've said, I think it's much more complex than that. And
Well, just look at this. I mean, this goes all the way back to the Bashi Bazooks in the 1870s. What was Gladstone's Great Midlothian campaign? It was an admonition against the, what is it? The Machiavellian and amoral foreign policy of Benjamin Disraeli. This goes back so many decades. What was the Greek intervention? If not that, we're going back 100 years before. This is just sort of the sort of casus belli of so many nationalities in this region, and for the sake of European intervention to follow shortly behind.
No, certainly. Thank you. So in terms of the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up is I want to just talk about the situation in Anatolia and the Caucasus, because by this point, if we just quickly go back to this map, obviously the British Mesopotamian campaigns completely pushed the Ottomans out of central and southern Iraq. The British have also been pushing up with the Arabs in Levant and Syria, and the Ottomans are just left with Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. But also the Russians in 1916 had launched this what's called the Erzurum offensive, which completely dislodged the Turks in eastern Anatolia. And this, again, was now a potential disaster because the Turks were fearing that, oh dear, the Russians are going to bowl in and completely overrun all of Anatolia. But then the saving grace for the Turks is the February Revolution with the Tsar's abdication. And then later you've had the October Revolution, where all Russian forces end up disbanding because Lenin makes his declarations of peace and declarations of land. And so promising all the Russian soldiers, oh, if you come back, we'll distribute land to you. So the entire army just sort of evaporates and abandons this region, which allows the Turks to come back in and retake these reoccupied regions. And what's there really bizarre is at this very late stage of the war, the relationship between the Germans and the Ottomans completely breaks down because the war's been such a disaster for the Ottomans especially, that a lot of Ottoman officers and civilians are blaming the Germans for pulling them into the war. So you're starting to see incidents where German officers are winding up being wounded or even dead in many instances. That's just how much enmity there was. But there's even more enmity over the situation with the collapsing Russian Empire. Enver Pasha and the Young Turks see this as an opportunity. Oh, we can now come in and fill the void in Transcaucasia. We can conquer Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And as a consolation prize for losing our southern territories, we can now get these new Turkic populations and get our hands on the oil from Baku. However, the Germans don't support this because they feel, well, we've invested millions of marks as well as men and resources and weaponry into the Ottoman Empire. We want a consolation prize from our involvement too. And so the Germans, they don't want this territory to be given to the Ottomans. They instead want to set up a series of protectorates over Azerbaijan and especially Georgia with Batumi, because that's the closest port to Baku, because they want to have their own supply of oil, which they can then ship back to Europe. And so you have this bizarre situation where Kressenstein, who I mentioned earlier, is deployed to Batumi, and you have Germans and Ottomans literally fighting each other over the Transcaucasus. And then, of course, the British come in as well, and the whole area is just total bedlam.
Well, if anything, this is the actioning of what I suggested would actually happen with the Triple Entente had they been completely victorious. Is that when it comes to the division of these territories, they would inevitably have conflict. As for the Germans, they were only able to seriously assert indirect control over the Baltic states and Lithuania and Western Ukraine. They projected their authority far beyond that, but they were never able to assert even indirect control over these regions. The German army would collapse shortly after, and then these regions would be very much heavily involved in the Russian Civil War. So yes, you're completely correct. Is that the Germans will want a return on this investment, and seeing a antagonistic Ottoman Empire break a German alliance in order to gobble up all of the Russian oil reserves in Azerbaijan would have been completely and utterly disastrous for them had they not collapsed shortly after.
No, certainly, and ultimately that was the last thing I really wanted to talk about, because obviously as we come to the end of the war with the total Ottoman surrender and the German surrender and the collapse of this alliance and the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, and so yeah, so
Well,
ultimately,
it should be noted, though, in a bizarre situation, the German Empire collapsed first. No one would have expected that, but that is technically true, and we shouldn't forget that the Ottoman Empire lingered on for another 3.5 years after the collapse and the abdication of the Kaiser in November of 1918. The Ottoman Empire continued as a fact up until 1922, and it wasn't destroyed as a result of the Entente powers, as we mentioned. They were intending to use the caliphate for their own purposes through the, again, potential state on the Straits or international settlement on the Straits controlling Constantinople. But essentially, what happened in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, is that it had the experience that Germany had from 1918 to 1939, but they had that span of 20 years compressed into a period of 6 years where they had their great national savior in the form of Kemal Ataturk fight off the Greeks who were by proxy, you can say, fighting for the Entente powers, annulling the Treaty of Sèvres and implementing the Treaty of Lucerne, which was far more favorable to the Turks and allowed them to establish control over territories gained, it should be mentioned, during the war, which were these territories that Enver Pasha was most focused on, which is not just the Orange territory you see, which was occupied by the Turkish Republic, but also part of the Kars, the Batum, and the Yerevan regions also were reincorporated back into Turkey. And thereafter, the Turks were able to form a positive relationship with the Soviets for the remainder of Ataturk's life. So, in a strange way, the Ottoman-Turkish situation was a happy ending compared to what we see with Germany during the same time period.
no, certainly, and yeah. So I just think, in summary, um, ultimately you could argue the Ottoman entry into the war led to their downfall, but I don't want to be too deterministic. I think had some different decisions been made, it could have worked out better. So again, I think abandoning this jihad strategy and instead employing the more, Lehman von Sanders idea of consolidating and holding on to territory would have been much, much more feasible, and then only sort of moderating, pushing out when you can afford to.
I mean, the other question is that of neutrality. And it was
Mm.
very difficult in World War One for a country to avoid being neutral. I think the most exceptional case of a country being successfully neutral during World War One was the Netherlands, for obvious reasons. But the reason that Germany was able to use the Netherlands as effective neutral power is that having the Netherlands essentially meant that Germany had a port, a neutral port to the rest of the world. Because of course Rotterdam was perhaps the most important of all the European ports at this time. Obviously, we're doing this covertly, and also the Netherlands could act as a potential mediator throughout the conflict and as a thoroughfare essentially for diplomatic activity. But it's remarkable in a way, given the situation that the Netherlands was surrounded on all sides by the Allies to the sea and the Germans on land, that it did remain neutral, something that wasn't achieved during the First World War. So given that situation, there would have to be basically a Netherlands-esque miracle in the East in order to ensure Ottoman neutrality. And given how high risk and how the Germans had so many investments and how the region intersected the great powers, essentially, it's possible. I've already mentioned the illusion with the Russians and the Armenians and the Turkish paranoia. Even in a neutral scenario, the Turks would have wanted to achieve some sort of preemptive strike against their own populations to forestall entry into the war. So I don't believe there is a scenario necessarily with the Ottomans where there isn't blood, whether it be an intensification of the ethnic conflicts, a form of civil war, or even what we saw with Persia, which is the foreign powers just occupying and carving up spheres of influence because the Ottoman Empire is too weak or too overcommitted to be able to deal with it. I don't think there is a positive scenario for the Ottomans under any situation. If anything, you could actually argue that the German alliance was perhaps their best situation, given everything, because the alternative would have been basically the concession to Sykes-Picot without a shot being fired, and indeed Russian concessions in Anatolia and the Straits. So yes, I think either way, the Ottomans have been facing an existential crisis since the end of the 18th century. And I think what I find is that the fact that the Ottomans survived so long is in itself a miracle. And the greatest sort of comedic aspect to all this point in history is that the moribund Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, managed to outlive the Tsar, the Austrian Emperor, and the German Kaiser.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating when you do think of it in that way. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on AM. This is a great discussion and a good conclusion to the stream we did the other week. Okay. Onto super chat. So no one sent anything during the stream from what I can see. However, Rongtao Wu did send me a super chat on the last stream I did, but due to an entry issue, I couldn't read it, so I'll read it now. He actually sent two, which were the same message, which was, I'm going to have to be at a meeting for a few hours. I apologize for not being able to watch it live, but wish you and Hunger well. And one was for $10 and another was for $3. So thank you very much, Rongtao Wu. Is there anything you want to share, AM, before we get out of here?
Just to say that Rongtao Wu is also very active over on my Discord, which you're also a member of. And he's also a great sort of a patron of mine as well. So thank you to Rongtao Wu. As for me, tomorrow afternoon, I am having a conversation with Charles Coulomb and Theo Howard on Belloc's case for a Catholic Republic. So completely different to today's conversation, but that's what I'm doing.
No, I'll certainly be giving that stream a listen to tomorrow because that sentiment is something I've been exploring and very interested to learn more about. In terms of this channel, not next Saturday, in 2 weeks' time, on the 7th of February, I should be getting Hunger back to do the next stream for the Modern Iran series. We'll be looking at the Qajar counter-revolution against the schemes and machinations of the constitutional revolutionaries in early 20th century Iran. So stay tuned and give that a watch. And also, I hope in the next couple of weeks to finally get Furious Person X back to do that Belisaria stream I've been promising for several months now. Hopefully we'll be able to get around to doing that shortly, permitting Marcus's availability. So thank you everybody for watching, and good night.